Chapter 1: Winter's Return. I awoke before the sun, same as every day for nigh on 5 years. The cold had settled deep into my bones overnight, making my shoulder, the one that caught a rebel bullet at Shiloh, ache something fierce. Through the frost-laced windows, the sky was just beginning to lighten from pitch black to that peculiar shade of gray-blue that always reminded me of a bruise healing. My feet hit the rough-hewn floorboards and I sucked in a sharp breath at the cold. No sense complaining about it. There wasn't nobody to hear it anyhow. I shuffled to the stone fireplace where last night's fire had dwindled to nothing but a few stubborn embers glowing faintly beneath a blanket of white ash. Taking up the poker, I stirred the embers, watching as tiny orange sparks swirled upward into the chimney. My hands, cracked and weathered as old leather, worked without much thought. Adding kindling just so, then a smaller log to catch. I'd done this same ritual more than 1,000 mornings, and if the good Lord saw fit, I'd do it 1,000 more. The cabin was small, but it suited me. A single room with a bed pushed against one wall, a table and single chair, a trunk for my few belongings. Simple, orderly, quiet. The walls bore little decoration. My Winchester hung on pegs above the door. Mama's Bible sat on the table, its leather binding worn smooth at the edges. And there, face down on the shelf, was the tintype I couldn't bring myself to look at, yet couldn't bear to throw away neither. The fire caught proper, and warmth began to seep into the air. I put the coffee pot on and went about shaving, scraping the straight razor over my skin with practiced care. The face looking back at me from the small mirror seemed to have gained new lines since yesterday, deep creases around eyes that had seen too much. As I buttoned my flannel shirt and reached for my ranger coat, my gaze drifted to the calendar tacked beside the door, December 3rd, 1878. The date hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind clean out of me. 5 years to the day. 5 years since I'd walked away from Clara Holloway on a morning cold as this one. 5 years since I'd told her I wasn't fit to be anybody's husband, let alone hers. 5 years of wondering if I'd done right by her, even knowing in my heart it was the kindest cruelty I could offer. I strapped on my holster, the weight of the Colt familiar against my hip. My fingers fumbled with the buckle, and I cursed under my breath. Weren't like me to be unsettled by memories. I'd gotten mighty good at pushing them down where they couldn't pester me. Lord, I whispered into the stillness, my breath frosting in the air, grant me strength today. I didn't elaborate on what kind of strength I was needing. The Almighty knew well enough. I pulled on my hat, grabbed my gloves, and pushed through the door into the bitter Wyoming cold. The wind hit me like a slap, but I welcomed it. Pain had a way of clearing a man's head, and I needed mine cleared something fierce today. 3 hours later, I trudged back toward my cabin, the morning's patrol having yielded nothing but frozen toes and a dusting of snow on my shoulders. I'd checked my trap lines, empty save for one scrawny rabbit, and scouted the lower ridge for any sign of the mountain lion that had been troubling Widow Jensen's sheep. No tracks, no scat, nothing but the vast, empty silence of winter settling in across the territory. I was 20 yards from my porch when I saw it, and the sight stopped me dead in my tracks. A basket. A wicker basket sitting plain as day on my front step, partially covered with what looked to be a patchwork quilt. I approached, cautious-like, rifle raised. Living alone in these parts, a man learned quick that unexpected gifts weren't generally gifts at all. Could be a trap. Could be a prank from one of the Thompson boys, though they rarely ventured this far from town. The quilt moved. Just a slight ripple, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I thumbed back the hammer of my rifle, inching closer, ready to fire if need be. When I was near enough, I used the barrel to nudge the edge of the quilt, lifting it just enough to peer beneath. What I saw sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the cold. A baby. A tiny infant, swaddled tight against the chill, sleeping peacefully as if my porch were the safest place in all. What in tarnation? I breathed, the rifle lowering of its own accord. My first thought was that someone had made a terrible mistake. My second was that some poor soul had abandoned their child, and Lord help me, they'd picked the wrong man to save it. I glanced around wildly, searching for any sign of who might have left such a burden, but the pristine snow around my cabin showed only my own tracks, coming and going. Whomever had brought this child had covered their trail mighty well. Setting my rifle aside, I knelt down, my knees popping in protest. A folded piece of paper was pinned to the infant's blanket. With fingers suddenly clumsy and trembling, I unpinned it, unfolded it, and held it close to make out the cramped handwriting in the weak winter light. Mr. McKenzie, this child is Lily, daughter of your brother Matthew and his wife Sarah. I delivered her into this world 5 months past, just before your sister-in-law took sick with grief after your brother's passing from the lung fever. Sarah made me promise to find you, said you was the only kin left. I've cared for the babe best I could, but I'm too old now, and the winter journey to St. Louis, where my daughter lives, is no place for an infant. She's a good baby. Hardly fusses except when hungry. God forgive me for leaving her so, but I've watched your cabin 2 days now, and I know you're a God-fearing man. The Lord will guide you in what to do. Mrs. Abigail Thorne, midwife. The letter slipped from my fingers as the world seemed to tilt beneath me. Matthew? Dead? His wife, too? The news hit me like a physical blow, though truth be told, I hadn't seen my brother in nearly 8 years. Not since before the war drove a wedge between us. Him supporting the Union, me riding with a Texas regiment despite our Pennsylvania raising. The bundle stirred and 2 eyes blinked open, regarding me with a startling clarity. Mackenzie blue, those eyes. The same shade as Pa's, same as Matthew's, same as mine. There was no denying whose child this was. "Hello there, Lily," I whispered, my voice rough as gravel. She didn't cry, just stared up at me like she was taking my measure. I'd faced Confederate artillery with less trepidation than I felt under that infant's gaze. "I reckon you've had quite a journey," I said, gently lifting the basket. It was lighter than I expected, this burden that had just changed everything. "Better get you inside before you catch your death." As I carried her into my solitary cabin, I couldn't help but think this was the Lord's idea of a jest, sending a baby to a man who couldn't even keep a woman's heart safe, let alone a child's life. That first hour with Lily was peaceful enough. She slept in her basket by the fire while I tried to make sense of what I was supposed to do with an infant. By midday, though, she'd awakened with a cry that near split my eardrums. Now, I said, lifting her awkwardly from the basket. She felt no heavier than a newborn rabbit, but far more fragile. No need for all that fuss. My words had about as much effect as trying to reason with a mountain lion. Her little face scrunched up something fierce, turning an alarming shade of red as she wailed louder. I held her against my shoulder like I'd seen women do with babies, patting her back with a gentleness I hadn't known my rough hands possessed. "You hungry?" I asked, pacing the worn floorboards of my cabin. "Of course you are. Foolish question." I'd found a glass bottle tucked in beside her in the basket, but it was empty now. The small tin of powdered milk I kept for my coffee wouldn't suit an infant. Even I knew that much. I had nothing to offer her but water, and she wasn't having none of that. The pacing continued, back and forth across the cabin, my boots wearing a path in the dust. Outside, the snow had started coming down in earnest, fat, heavy flakes that promised to pile up quick. Through the window, I could barely make out the pine trees at the edge of my clearing. "Perfect timing you got, little miss," I muttered. "First real storm of the season." Lily responded by crying harder, tiny fists balled up tight. I bounced her gently, tried humming a tune my mama used to sing, but nothing calmed her. The nearest neighbor, Old Man Parsons, was a good 15 miles south, even if he knew a lick about babies, which I doubted. The journey would be dangerous in this weather. As for Timber Creek, that was a half-day's ride in good conditions. With this snow and a baby to protect, it would take far longer. And what would I do when I got there? Who would take in an orphaned infant with no warning? The answer came quick as lightning, and I pushed it away just as fast. No, anyone but her. Lily's cries grew more pitiful, less angry and more desperate. Fear twisted in my gut. What if she was sick? What if she was hurting? I had no way of knowing, no experience to draw from. "Hush now, little one," I pleaded, feeling more helpless than I had since watching friends bleed out on a battlefield with no surgeon in sight. "I don't know what you need." My own voice sounded strange to my ears, raw with an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. For the first time since finding her, the reality of the situation struck me full force. This wasn't some temporary inconvenience. This was Matthew's daughter, my brother's child, my blood, my responsibility, and I was failing her already. The weight of it drove me to my knees beside the bed, still clutching her to my chest. Her cries had become whimpers now, like she was too exhausted to make a proper fuss anymore, and that scared me worse than the screaming. "Lord," I whispered, my voice breaking, "I ain't asked for much these past years, and I know I ain't deserved your favor anyhow." The words came hard, rusty from disuse. "But I'm asking now. Help me save this innocent little one. She ain't done nothing to deserve being left with the likes of me." I felt a tear track down my cheek and didn't bother wiping it away. "If you're punishing me for my sins, that's your right. But don't punish her, please." Lily's whimpering slowed, and I glanced down, half afraid of what I'd see. But her eyes, those McKenzie blue eyes, were open now, regarding me with an expression that seemed far too knowing for one so small. Her cries tapered off completely, and one tiny hand escaped the swaddling. I offered my finger, and she gripped it with surprising strength. Something shifted in my chest at that moment, a breaking loose of feelings I'd walled up good and tight. "All right, Lily McKenzie," I said, my voice steadier now. "First thing tomorrow, we're heading to town, storm or no storm. I don't know a blessed thing about raising babies, but I do know this. You deserve better than what I can give you here." The decision settled on me with a strange sense of rightness. I knew it would mean seeing Clara again after all this time. I knew it would hurt worse than any physical pain I'd endured. But this wasn't about me anymore. I climbed back to my feet, Lily still clutching my finger, and looked out at the thickening snowfall. "Rest up, little one. We've got a hard journey ahead." The next day brought a brief lull in the storm, though the sky hung low and threatening, promising more snow before nightfall. I'd spent hours preparing, fashioning a sling to carry Lily close to my body for warmth, wrapping her in every scrap of cloth I could spare, packing the few supplies she'd arrived with in my saddlebags. By mid-afternoon, we'd reached Timber Creek, my faithful gelding picking his way carefully through drifts nearly reaching his knees in places. Lily had been mercifully quiet most of the journey, lulled perhaps by the motion or simply too cold and hungry to cry. I bypassed the main street, avoiding curious eyes, and rode directly to the schoolhouse at the edge of town. Classes would be letting out soon if they hadn't already given the weather. I needed to speak with Clara before she left for home. The thought of seeing her again after 5 years set my heart hammering against my ribs. Would she even agree to hear me out? Would she slam the door in my face? She'd have every right to. Tying my horse to the hitching post, I adjusted Lily in her makeshift sling and approached the schoolhouse door. Through the window, I could see a handful of children bundling up in coats and scarves, Clara moving among them, checking buttons and tying mufflers with gentle hands. I stepped back into the shadow of the building's eave, unwilling to make a spectacle in front of her students. Soon enough, the door burst open and children spilled out, their excited voices carrying in the still, cold air as they rushed home through the snow. "Straight home now," Clara called after them. "No dawdling in this weather." Her voice hit me like a physical blow, softer than I remembered, yet with the same quiet authority. I waited until the last child disappeared around the bend in the road before climbing the steps. My gloved hand hovered over the door. One knock, and it'd be no turning back. One knock, and I'd have to face the woman I'd walked away from, the only woman I'd ever loved. For Lily's sake, I reminded myself, only for Lily. I rapped 3 times, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon. Inside, I heard movement, then footsteps approaching. The door swung open, and there she stood. Clara Holloway hadn't changed, not in any way that mattered. Her auburn hair was still pulled back in that neat bun, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. Her eyes were the same warm brown I remembered, wide and expressive. Her skin was perhaps a shade paler, her frame a touch thinner, but she was still Clara, still impossibly beautiful. Those expressive eyes widened at the sight of me, shock and something else. something that cut deep, flashing across her features. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other, 5 years of unspoken words hanging in the air between us. "Miss Holloway," I finally managed, my voice rougher than I intended. "Ranger McKenzie," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. Her gaze dropped to the bundle against my chest, confusion creasing her brow. "What?" Before she could finish, Lily chose that moment to wake, emitting a pitiful cry that seemed to echo in the silent schoolyard. Clara's reaction was immediate, her expression shifting from guarded to concerned in the blink of an eye. "You have a baby?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not exactly." I shifted Lily in my arms so Clara could see her better. "This here's Lily, my brother's child. She was left on my doorstep yesterday with a note saying both her parents have passed." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, the poor dear." All wariness momentarily forgotten, she stepped closer, maternal instinct clearly overriding whatever reservations she had about me. "How old is she?" 5 months, according to the letter, and I swallowed hard, pride a bitter taste in my mouth. "I need help, Clara. She hasn't eaten proper since yesterday, and I don't know the first thing about caring for an infant." Clara looked from the baby to me, a dozen emotions crossing her face too quick to name. Outside, the snow began falling again, thick and relentless. She glanced at the darkening sky, then back to Lily's tiny red face. I saw the moment her decision was made. Her shoulders straightened and her chin lifted in that determined way I remembered so well. "You'd better come in," she said, stepping back from the door, "before you both catch your death." Chapter 2. Reluctant Allies. I stood awkwardly just inside the schoolhouse door, snow melting from my coat in small puddles around my boots, while Clara bustled about with surprising efficiency. The classroom was warm from the pot-bellied stove in the corner, the neat rows of desks a sharp contrast to the chaos I'd brought in with me. "Set her here," Clara instructed, clearing a space on her desk and laying down what looked to be her own shawl as padding. "I'll heat some milk." I placed Lily down as gently as I could, afraid my rough hands might somehow damage her. The infant's cries had weakened to whimpers that tore at something raw inside me. Clara moved to a small cupboard, withdrew a bottle not unlike the one that had been left with Lily, and began preparing a mixture with experienced hands. "You've done this before," I observed, hovering uselessly nearby. "The Wilkins baby, last winter." Her words were clipped, focused on her task rather than on me. "Marie took ill with influenza after the birth. I helped tend the infant while she recovered." I nodded, watching her measure and mix with precise movements. Her hair had come loose from its pins during her preparations, a tendril of auburn falling across her cheek. My fingers twitched with the memory of tucking such a strand behind her ear once upon a time. "How did she come to be in your care?" Clara asked, testing the milk's temperature on her wrist before turning to gather Lily into her arms. I explained in as few words as possible. The basket, the letter, Matthew and Sarah's passing, each detail emerged stiff and halting, like fence posts being dragged from frozen ground. "I'm powerful sorry about your brother," Clara said softly, and I could tell she meant it despite everything between us. That was Clara's way. A heart too generous for her own good. She settled into her chair, cradling Lily with a natural grace I couldn't hope to match. The moment the bottle touched her lips, the baby began sucking with desperate hunger, tiny hands reaching up to grasp at nothing. "Poor little mite," Clara murmured, her expression tender. "She's half starved." I removed my hat, turning the brim in my hands. I didn't know what to do for her. Tried water, but she wouldn't take it. Clara glanced up, her eyes softening slightly at whatever she saw in my face. "It's not your fault, Jed. Babies need milk, properly prepared." The use of my given name hung in the air between us. A slip, perhaps, or a momentary thaw in her careful formality. She returned her attention to Lily, and I couldn't help but notice how right she looked with a child in her arms. It was a sight I'd dreamed of once, long ago, before I came to my senses and realized what a poor excuse for a husband I'd make. "What are your plans for her?" Clara asked after a spell of silence, her gaze fixed on Lily rather than me. I cleared my throat. That's why I'm here. I was hoping someone in town might take her in, a proper family like, someone who knows about babies and such. And who did you have in mind? I shifted uncomfortably. I thought perhaps Pastor Wells might know of someone suitable. Clara's eyes flicked up to mine, sharp with sudden understanding. Surely you don't expect me to take her, she said, her voice tight with an old hurt I had no right to feel wounded by. You made your feelings about family quite clear, Ranger McKenzie. The return to my title stung worse than the cold. I removed my hat, humility burning in my chest and evident, I'm sure, in my posture. I'd never been good at hiding my feelings, least of all from Clara. I ain't asking for myself, Miss Holloway, I said quietly. I'm asking for her. Something flickered across Clara's face. A battle between the hurt I'd caused her and the compassion that was as much a part of her as breathing. She looked down at Lily, who had fallen asleep at the bottle, milk drunk and peaceful for the first time since coming into my care. The storm is worsening, she finally said, nodding toward the window, where snow now swirled in a frenzy. Pastor Wells lives on the other side of town, and it would be cruel to take her back out in this weather. I followed her gaze, noting how the wind had picked up, driving the snow sideways against the glass. I have a small cottage not far from here, Clara continued, her tone carefully measured. You can bring her there for tonight. Tomorrow, when the weather clears, we'll speak with the pastor. Relief flooded through me, though I did my best not to show it. That's more than generous, Miss Holloway. It's not for you, she said, echoing my own words back to me. It's for her. By the time we reached Clara's cottage, the storm had become a full-blown blizzard. Wind howled around the eaves, driving snow into drifts that already reached halfway up the porch steps. I struggled to shelter Lily inside my coat as Clara fumbled with the key, her hands red with cold despite her woolen gloves. The cottage door finally swung open, and we stumbled inside, bringing a swirl of snowflakes with us. The contrast between the howling wilderness outside and the snug interior of Clara's home struck me immediately. Where my cabin was sparse and utilitarian, her cottage was a reflection of herself, orderly yet warm, practical yet beautiful in its simplicity. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with neatly arranged volumes. A small sofa, upholstered in faded blue fabric, sat before a hearth where embers still glowed faintly. Delicate curtains framed the windows, and a colorful, braided rug covered most of the plank floor. The very rug I was now dripping melted snow onto, like some great lumbering ox. I'm making a mess of your floor, I said, trying to step back toward the door, but only succeeding in widening the puddle beneath my boots. Stay put, Clara instructed, taking Lily from my arms. Remove your boots and coat there. I'll get a fire going. I did as told, feeling as awkward and out of place as a grizzly at a ladies' tea party. Everything in the cottage seemed too delicate for my rough hands, too clean for my trail-worn presence. This was Clara's sanctuary, and I was an intruder bringing chaos to her ordered world. Once I'd divested myself of my snow-covered outer garments, I stood uncertainly in my stocking feet, watching as Clara efficiently built up the fire with one hand while cradling Lily against her shoulder with the other. There are towels in the cupboard beside the washstand, she said without looking up. Dry yourself properly before you catch your death. The concern in her voice, however practical, warmed something inside me that had been cold for far too long. I found the towels where she'd indicated and did my best to make myself presentable. By the time I'd finished, Clara had Lily unwrapped on the sofa and was examining her with practiced care. She needs fresh wrappings, Clara announced, and proper clothes. Did the midwife leave nothing else with her? I shook my head. Just what she was wearing and the bottle. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line, but she made no comment on the inadequacy of the situation. Instead, she rose and disappeared briefly into what I presumed was her bedroom, returning with an armful of soft fabrics. I can cut down some flannel from my sewing chest for diapers, she said, laying out the items on the sofa. And this chemise can be fashioned into a gown of sorts until we can obtain proper baby clothes. I watched, fascinated despite myself, as Clara's clever fingers quickly transformed simple household items into necessities for an infant. She opened a drawer from her small writing desk, lined it with a folded quilt, and created a passable cradle for Lily. Hand me that pillow, she instructed, pointing to a small cushion on the rocking chair. I brought it to her, and our fingers brushed as I passed it over. The brief contact sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the cold, and judging by the way Clara snatched her hand back, she'd felt it too. We both retreated a step, as if burned by the memory of all we'd once been to each other. Clara busied herself with settling Lily into her makeshift bed while I stared into the fire, trying to make sense of the tumult of feelings this day had stirred up. When I finally turned back, Clara was tucking a blanket around Lily's tiny form, her expression softening as she looked down at the sleeping infant. "She's beautiful," Clara said softly. "She has the McKenzie eyes." "That she does," I agreed, my voice rougher than I intended. Clara straightened, and the moment of tenderness was gone, replaced by the careful guardedness I'd come to expect. She moved to a small linen chest and withdrew blankets and a pillow. "You can sleep here by the hearth," she said, arranging the bedding on the floor. "It will be warm enough, and you'll hear Lily if she wakes in the night." I nodded, accepting the arrangement without argument, though the thought of spending the night under Clara's roof, so close yet so far from her, was its own kind of torment. "This arrangement is only until the storm passes," Clara added, her tone making it clear this was non-negotiable. "Then you'll need to make permanent arrangements." "Yes, ma'am," I responded, the formality a shield against the intimacy of the situation. Clara looked as though she might say more, but instead turned and retreated to her bedroom, closing the door with a soft but decisive click that seemed to emphasize the boundaries between us. Boundaries I had created and had no right to resent. Left alone with the sleeping Lily and the crackling fire, I sank onto the floor beside my makeshift bed, head in my hands. In the space of 2 days, my carefully constructed solitude had been completely upended. I now found myself in Clara Holloway's home, responsible for an orphaned infant, and confronting all the feelings I'd spent 5 years trying to outrun. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside my heart. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when a sound pulled me from exhausted slumber. The fire had burned low, casting the room in amber shadows that danced across the ceiling. For a moment, I couldn't place where I was. The softness beneath me unfamiliar after years of my hard bunk. Then I heard it again, Lily's fretful cry followed by a gentle shushing that brought me fully awake. Clara had emerged from her bedroom, dressed in a nightgown and wrapper, her hair hanging in a long braid down her back. She moved to the makeshift cradle and lifted Lily with such natural grace that my breath caught in my throat. I kept my eyes nearly closed, watching through my lashes as she cradled the infant against her shoulder. "There now, little one," she whispered, her voice soft as new snow. "What troubles you at this hour?" Lily's cries continued, though somewhat muffled against Clara's shoulder. Clara began to pace slowly before the hearth, her bare feet silent on the braided rug. As she walked, she started to sing, so quietly at first I could barely hear the words. It was an old hymn, one my mother used to sing when storms frightened me as a boy. Clara's voice was pure and sweet, rising and falling like a gentle tide as she sang of God's watchful care through the darkness of night. The melody wrapped around the room like a warm blanket, and I found myself holding my breath, afraid any movement might break the spell she was weaving. In the flickering firelight, Clara's face was transformed. Gone was the carefully composed schoolmarm with her guarded expression. Here, thinking herself unobserved, she allowed her features to soften with tenderness for the child in her arms. But beneath that compassion, I could see a shadow of something else. A lingering sadness around her eyes, a downward turn at the corners of her mouth when she paused between verses. It hit me then, with the force of a physical blow, that I had put that sadness there. 5 years ago, I'd walked away believing I was doing right by her. Instead, I'd left a wound that time hadn't fully healed. Lily's cries gradually subsided under Clara's gentle ministrations. The baby's tiny hand had wrapped around one of Clara's fingers, holding tight as her eyes grew heavy. "That's it," Clara murmured, pressing her lips to Lily's forehead. "Sleep now, precious one." She continued to rock and sway for several minutes more, ensuring Lily was truly settled before moving to return her to the drawer cradle. As she bent to lay the baby down, Clara paused, studying the sleeping infant's face with an expression so wistful it made my chest ache. Your uncle is a complicated man, little one, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the popping of the fire. Guard your heart better than I did mine. The words pierced me deeper than any bullet ever had. I'd taken a Confederate Miney ball to the shoulder at Shiloh that had laid me up for weeks, but that pain was nothing compared to hearing the hurt in Clara's voice. I'd told myself 100 times that leaving her had been a mercy, that she deserved better than a man haunted by war. But lying there in the shadows of her home, witnessing the aftermath of my decision, I wondered for the first time if I'd been wrong. Clara tucked the blanket around Lily with tender care, then returned to her room, closing the door softly behind her. I rolled onto my back, staring at the ceiling, sleep now impossible. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but its mournful sound couldn't drown out Clara's words echoing in my mind. Morning brought watery sunlight and the welcome cessation of the storm. I rose before Clara or Lily stirred, rekindled the fire, and set the coffee pot to boil, as a poor attempt at gratitude for the previous night's shelter. When Clara emerged from her bedroom, already dressed for the day with her hair neatly pinned, she seemed surprised to find me up and about. "You've made coffee," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Least I could do," I replied, avoiding her eyes. After what I'd overheard in the night, facing her directly felt like more courage than I possessed. "Thought I'd head to the general store, pick up some supplies for Lily before talking to Pastor Wells." Clara nodded, moving to check on the still sleeping infant. "She'll need proper diapers, clothes, another bottle. Mrs. Abernathy should have most of what you need at the store." "I'm obliged for the list," I said, pulling on my boots, "and for taking us in last night. I know it wasn't easy for you." Her hand stilled their adjustment of Lily's blanket. "As I said, it was for her sake." After a moment, she added, "I'll keep her here while you're out. No sense in exposing her to the cold again." I nodded, grateful for the pragmatic kindness that was so essentially Clara, even when directed at a man who'd hurt her. With a final glance at Lily's peaceful face, I donned my coat and hat and stepped out into the brilliant white world the storm had created. The walk to the general store was like navigating a different town entirely from the one I'd ridden into yesterday. Snow lay pristine and knee-deep in places, transforming the familiar streets into something out of a picture book. The air held that peculiar stillness that often follows a heavy snow, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Timber Creek's general store sat at the crossroads of Main Street and what the townspeople optimistically called Commerce Avenue, though it boasted little more than the blacksmith shop and the cattleman's bank. I stomped my boots on the porch to clear them of snow before pushing open the door, setting the bell to jingling. The warm interior smelled of coffee, leather, and the particular blend of dry goods and tobacco that seemed universal to general stores across the territory. I'd barely taken 2 steps inside when I realized my error in thinking I could complete this errand without attracting notice. Despite the early hour, no fewer than 6 townsfolk were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, and every head turned at my entrance. "Well, I'll be Hank!" Hank Abernathy, the storekeeper, was the first to break the startled silence. "If it isn't Ranger McKenzie himself come down from his mountain. What brings you to civilization, Jed? Spring ain't even thought about springing yet." I cleared my throat, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "Morning, Hank. Just need a few supplies." "Must be important supplies to bring you through a blizzard," observed Ed Miller, the blacksmith, his bushy eyebrows raised in obvious curiosity. Before I could formulate a response, the door to the storeroom swung open and Mrs. Abernathy appeared, her ample figure filling the doorway before she spotted me and broke into a wide smile. "Jedediah McKenzie! The Lord does work in mysterious ways." She bustled forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "News travels fast in a storm, you know. Martha Jenkins lives next door to Miss Holloway and saw you arrive with the baby yesterday evening. Is it true?" I suppressed a groan. Of course the town gossips were already at work. In a community this size, privacy was as rare as palm trees. "Yes, ma'am," I admitted, seeing no point in denial. "My brother's child. I've come for some baby necessities." What followed was like being caught in a flash flood. Mrs. Abernathy's excitement washed over me in a torrent of questions and exclamations as she darted about the store, gathering items I hadn't even known to ask for. "A little girl," Martha said. "How old? What's her name? Does she favor your side of the family or her mother's?" Poor little lamb, orphaned so young. Thank the Lord she has her uncle to care for her. You'll need diapers, of course, and proper gowns. Not those ready-mades, they're poorly stitched. I've some good flannel in the back. And bottles, more than one for certain, rubber nipples too. And what about a cradle? Hank, didn't the Petersons leave that nice pine cradle when they moved to Denver? I stood there, overwhelmed by her efficiency and unable to get a word in edgewise as she piled items on the counter. The other customers watched with undisguised interest, occasionally adding their own suggestions to Mrs. Abernathy's growing inventory of baby requirements. I always knew you'd make a fine father someday, Mrs. Abernathy declared cheerfully, measuring out lengths of soft white fabric. Her matter-of-fact tone suggested this development was completely expected rather than the upheaval it truly was. And how fortunate that Miss Holloway has taken you in. She's refused every suitor since you left town, you know. That statement, delivered with the casual brutality that only small-town gossips can achieve, landed like a physical blow. I fumbled the coins I'd been counting onto the counter, several rolling away across the polished surface. "It ain't like that, ma'am," I managed, my usual stoicism deserting me entirely. Heat crept up my neck as I scrambled to collect the scattered coins. "This is just temporary, until proper arrangements can be made for the child." Mrs. Abernathy's knowing smile made it clear she didn't believe me for a moment. "Of course, Ranger Mackenzie. Temporary." She winked at the other women now gathered around the counter. Though I must say Martha mentioned how natural Miss Holloway looked carrying that baby into her cottage, almost like she was born to it. I cleared my throat, desperate to change the subject. "About that cradle you mentioned." "Already sent Hank to fetch it from the storeroom," she replied smugly. "And I've taken the liberty of adding some preserved peaches to your order. Miss Holloway is partial to them, if memory serves. No extra charge." I considered protesting, but recognized the futility. Instead, I nodded stiffly and counted out more coins, eager to complete this transaction and escape the knowing looks being exchanged over my head. By the time I left the store, my arms were laden with packages and my ears burning from the none-no-subtle hints and suggestions that had followed me to the door. "The cradle would be delivered later," Mrs. Abernathy assured me, her eyes twinkling with matchmaking mischief as she waved goodbye. I trudged back through the snow toward Clara's cottage, my mind churning with what I'd learned. Clara had refused all suitors since I'd left? The knowledge should have brought satisfaction, confirmation that I'd been right to leave, that she deserved better than to settle for a man like me. Instead, it filled me with a complicated mix of regret and something dangerously close to hope. Temporary, I reminded myself aloud, my breath fogging in the cold air. This is all temporary. But, as Clara's cottage came into view, smoke curling invitingly from its chimney, I couldn't silence the treacherous voice in my heart that whispered, "What if it doesn't have to be?" Chapter 3, Building Bridges. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming winter day where the sun shines bright enough to blind but offers no real warmth. I'd spent another 2 nights on Clara's floor, each of us maintaining a careful distance while jointly tending to Lily's needs. By unspoken agreement, we'd fallen into a routine that minimized conversation beyond what was necessary for the baby's care. I rose early and slipped out to the boarding house where Mrs. Abernathy had delivered the pine cradle and other supplies I'd purchased. There, I washed up proper and changed into my one decent suit, a well-worn navy affair I'd purchased in Cheyenne 3 years prior and had worn exactly twice since. The collar chafed against my freshly shaved neck as I made my way back to Clara's cottage. "I thought we might attend services this morning," I said when she answered my knock, noting her surprise at my transformed appearance. "Pastor Wells should be consulted about arrangements for Lily," Clara nodded, a flicker of something I couldn't name crossing her features. "I was planning to attend, as I do every Sunday. I've prepared Lily for the outing as well." Indeed, the baby looked different than I'd left her, dressed in what appeared to be a hastily altered infant gown that Clara must have sewn during the night. A tiny cap covered her wispy hair, and she was wrapped in a shawl far finer than anything she'd arrived with. "You've been sewing for her?" I observed, touched despite myself. "She can't very well attend her first church service in rags," Clara replied, her practical tone belied by the gentle way she adjusted Lily's cap. The walk to the white clapboard church at the center of town was silent, save for the crunch of our boots on packed snow. We arrived just as the bell began to toll, joining the stream of townsfolk making their way inside. I noticed more than a few curious glances cast our way, but Clara kept her chin high, her expression serene as she carried Lily through the door. I'd intended to take a seat in the back, my usual spot on the rare occasions I attended services. To my surprise, Clara hesitated at the end of her usual pew, third from the front on the right side, clearly expecting me to join her. I slid in beside her, acutely aware of the whispers that rippled through the congregation at this development. The familiar scents of beeswax candles, hymnals, and Sunnybest pomade filled the air as townsfolk settled into their places. Mrs. Jenkins, who Clara had mentioned was her neighbor, leaned across the aisle to peek at Lily, her expression softening at the sight of the sleeping infant. "She's just precious," she whispered. "What a blessing for you both." Before either of us could correct her assumption, she'd returned to her seat, a satisfied smile on her face. I shifted uncomfortably, the wooden pew hard beneath me. My damp hair dripped occasionally down my collar, a reminder of my rushed attempts to make myself presentable. Beside me, Clara sat straight-backed and composed, though I noticed how her fingers nervously smoothed Lily's blanket over and over. Pastor Wells entered from the side door, his kind face breaking into a smile at the sight of us sitting together. As he began the service, I found myself watching Clara more than listening to the hymns. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows caught in her auburn hair, creating a halo effect that made my chest tighten with feelings I had no right to entertain. When it came time for the sermon, Pastor Wells opened his Bible to the book of Isaiah. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord," he read, his resonant voice filling the small church. Today we will consider how God works in mysterious ways, leading us down unexpected paths to redemption. I could have sworn his eyes lingered on Clara and me as he spoke those words. His sermon continued in that vein, speaking of how the Lord often brings blessings disguised as challenges, and how seemingly closed doors can lead to open windows of opportunity we never imagined for ourselves. "The hardest lesson for any of us," Pastor Wells said toward the end, "is surrendering our carefully laid plans to God's greater wisdom. Pride tells us we know best. Faith asks us to trust that the Almighty sees a picture larger than we can comprehend." By the time the final hymn was sung, I felt as though the pastor had been speaking directly to my soul, addressing questions I hadn't even admitted to myself. Lily had awakened during the closing prayer, but remained remarkably quiet, her solemn blue eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. As the congregation began to file out, many paused to greet Clara and get a closer look at Lily. I stood awkwardly by, nodding acknowledgments but saying little. Only when the church had nearly emptied did I finally speak. "I have secured rooms at the boarding house," I said stiffly, conscious of the lingering parishioners still within earshot. "I'll take Lily now." Clara's expression tightened almost imperceptibly as she clutched Lily closer. "The boarding house is no place for an infant," she began, but was interrupted by Pastor Wells approaching from behind me. "Brother Mackenzie," he said warmly, laying a hand on my shoulder, "I was hoping to have a word with you before you departed." His gaze moved between us, then settled on Lily. I couldn't help overhearing. "Raising a child alone while maintaining your ranger duties seems nearly impossible." I bristled slightly at his presumption, though I knew he meant well. "I aim to work something out." The pastor's eyes twinkled as he looked meaningfully between Clara and me. "Perhaps there's a more collaborative solution? If you both have a moment, I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss this further in my study." Clara and I exchanged a glance. The first direct eye contact we'd shared all morning. Something passed between us, a mutual recognition that neither of us had a better plan to offer. "I suppose a brief discussion couldn't hurt," Clara conceded, adjusting Lily in her arms. "Excellent," Pastor Wells beamed. "Right this way." The pastor's study was a small room attached to the church, lined with bookshelves and warmed by a cast-iron stove in the corner. It smelled of pipe tobacco and leather-bound books, with hints of the lemon polish Clara's students had likely applied to the heavy oak desk during Friday's chores. Pastor Wells gestured for us to take the two chairs facing his desk while he settled into his worn leather seat. Lily had dozed off again in Clara's arms, her tiny pink mouth slightly open in sleep. "Now then," the pastor began, steepling his fingers, "let's discuss the situation plainly. Jedediah, you find yourself unexpectedly responsible for your brother's child, a responsibility that, while God-given, conflicts with your duties as a ranger." I nodded stiffly, uncomfortable with having my predicament laid out so bluntly. "And Miss Holloway," he continued, turning to Clara, "you have experience with children and, from what I've observed, a natural affinity for this little one, yet you have your teaching responsibilities to consider." Clara's cheeks colored slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I've managed these past 2 days, though it hasn't been without challenges." Pastor Wells leaned forward. What if there were an arrangement that could benefit all parties involved? Most importantly, little Lily. "What sort of arrangement?" I asked, my voice guarded. "The Jensen property has stood empty since old Thomas passed last fall," Pastor Wells explained. "It's a small house, but sound, with 2 bedrooms and close enough to town that Miss Holloway could easily walk to the schoolhouse." I frowned, not following his logic. "You're suggesting I rent it?" "I'm suggesting you establish a temporary home there, yes. One where you could maintain your ranger duties on a limited basis while Miss Holloway assists with Lily's care during the day." Clara sat up straighter. "Pastor, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm suggesting a practical solution to a pressing problem," he interrupted gently. "You would maintain your separate lives, of course. Jed could patrol during school hours and return to care for Lily in the evenings, while you, Clara, could tend to her during your teaching day. The arrangement would be understood by all to be for the child's welfare alone." I rubbed my jaw, considering. It made practical sense, though the thought of living so close to Clara, of seeing her daily after 5 years of carefully maintained distance, was daunting. "The roof of the schoolhouse still leaks," Pastor Wells added, as if the thought had just occurred to him. "And I believe Miss Holloway mentioned at last month's church council that splitting firewood has become difficult for her." I glanced at Clara, who was now studiously avoiding my gaze. "I could see to those things," I said slowly, "as compensation for her help with Lily." "A fair exchange of services," Pastor Wells nodded approvingly. "Shall we draft the particulars?" The next half hour was spent hammering out details. My rent for the Jensen place would be minimal, with most of the payment coming in the form of repairs to both properties. Clara would care for Lily during school hours and assist with her needs in the evenings when necessary. I would maintain limited ranger patrols while ensuring both homes had adequate firewood and repairs. As Pastor Wells jotted down the terms on a sheet of paper, Clara finally spoke up. "This is strictly a practical arrangement," she insisted, focusing on the document rather than meeting my eyes. "For Lily's welfare alone." "Of course," I agreed, though something in my chest tightened at the finality in her tone. "Just until spring, when I can make more permanent plans." Pastor Wells looked up from his writing, his pen poised above the paper. "The Lord often plants seeds in winter that don't reveal their purpose until spring," he observed mildly, his eyes twinkling with something that looked suspiciously like hope. Neither Clara nor I had a response to that. Instead, we both signed the makeshift contract, our signatures separated by several inches of blank space, a fitting representation of the careful distance we intended to maintain. As we rose to leave, Lily awakened and began to fuss. Without thinking, I reached for her, and Clara transferred her to my arms with a smoothness that belied our supposed awkwardness. The baby quieted immediately, her tiny hand grasping my lapel. "See," Pastor Wells smiled, "already you're working together for her benefit. I have every faith this arrangement will prove a blessing to all involved." I caught Clara's eye over Lily's head, and for just a moment the wall between us seemed a little less insurmountable. Then she looked away, gathering her things, and the moment passed, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined it entirely. A week after our meeting in Pastor Wells' study, I found myself in the small Jensen house, attempting to create some semblance of a home from the meager furnishings I'd cobbled together. The town had rallied in that peculiar way small communities do when faced with an orphaned child. Mrs. Abernathy contributed linens, the blacksmith's wife sent over a rocking chair she claimed was just gathering dust, and even old Mr. Fletcher from the bank provided a wooden chest that now served as storage for Lily's growing collection of necessities. Perhaps the cradle would be better by the fireplace, Clara suggested, her arms full of neatly folded diapers as she entered from the second bedroom. It stays warmest there through the night. I nodded and shifted the pine cradle accordingly, noting how she kept a careful distance as she moved past me to arrange the baby things on the small side table. We'd fallen into this dance over the past days, attending to Lily's needs with shared purpose, but maintaining a space between us that might as well have been the Grand Canyon, for all our willingness to bridge it. The stove works well enough, I said, more to break the silence than anything. Chimney needed cleaning, but it draws proper now. Good, Clara replied, her attention on organizing bottles and tiny garments. The nights have been getting colder. Lily lay on a blanket near the hearth, contentedly batting at a small cloth doll another of the townsfolk had provided. At nearly 6 months, she was becoming more alert daily, her eyes tracking our movements with an intelligence that sometimes unnerved me. Those eyes, Mackenzie blue to be sure, but with a spark of something that reminded me painfully of Matthew. The sound of the front door opening again drew my attention. Clara had stepped out to her wagon and now returned carrying a small pine branch and a wooden box. "What's this?" I asked, frowning as she cleared a space in the corner. "Every home needs a Christmas tree," she said simply, setting the branch in a bucket she'd filled with stones for stability. "Especially a home with a child." I opened my mouth to object. I hadn't celebrated Christmas properly since before the war. But the words died on my lips as Clara opened the box to reveal a handful of simple ornaments. There were painted wooden stars, a few glass baubles wrapped carefully in cloth, and what appeared to be paper angels, likely made by her students. As she hung the first ornament, a star painted gold that caught the afternoon light, Lily's gaze fixed on the shining object, her tiny mouth forming a perfect O of wonder. Christmas was Matthew's favorite, I said unexpectedly, surprising even myself with the rare mention of my brother. The memory surfaced unbidden. Matthew insisting on decorating, even during the lean years, finding beauty in the simplest things. Him always said even the darkest season needs light. Clara's hands stilled on the ornament she was hanging, and when she looked at me, her expression had softened from its usual guardedness. Something passed between us then, a shared understanding of loss, perhaps, or simple appreciation for the memory of a man neither of us would see again in this life. "That sounds like wisdom worth honoring," she said quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice for a moment. To cover the unexpected emotion, I moved to the fireplace and added another log, though the room was already plenty warm. Clara continued decorating the small tree, and I found myself watching her more than the task warranted. Her movements were graceful and sure, her profile illuminated by the late afternoon sun slanting through the west-facing window. For just a moment, I allowed myself to imagine a different reality, one where this scene was not temporary, where Clara moved through this space as if it were truly ours. The dangerous thought was interrupted when she spoke again, her back still to me as she adjusted the final ornament. "The students are presenting a Christmas pageant in 2 weeks," she said, her tone carefully casual. "Perhaps you and Lily might attend?" The invitation hung in the air between us, weighted with more significance than the simple words conveyed. This wasn't just about a children's performance. It was a tentative step toward something neither of us had named. "I expect Lily would enjoy that," I replied, matching her casual tone while my heart hammered foolishly in my chest. "If you think it wouldn't be too much for her." "Children are remarkably adaptable," Clara said, finally turning to face me. "More so than adults, I find." Our eyes met briefly before she gathered her shawl, preparing to leave for her own home as she did each evening after helping settle Lily. The routine was established. Now Clara would return in the morning to take Lily to the schoolhouse while I rode patrol, and I would collect my niece at day's end. "Tomorrow, then," she said at the door, her gaze resting momentarily on Lily, who had dozed off on her blanket. "Tomorrow," I echoed, watching as she pulled her shawl tighter against the December chill and made her way down the path that would take her back to her own solitary cottage. Several days later, I found myself in dire straits with a screaming Lily and a seemingly insurmountable task. I'd returned from patrol to find a note from Clara explaining she'd been delayed by a parent meeting but would arrive shortly. In the meantime, Lily had awakened hungry from her late afternoon nap, and my attempts to prepare her bottle were proving disastrous. Now, I soothed, awkwardly bouncing her on my hip while trying to measure the powdered milk with my free hand. Uncle Jed's working on it. Just need a minute more. Lily was wholly unimpressed by my reasoning, her face scrunched in outrage as she continued to wail. I'd already spilled the first batch, and the second attempt wasn't faring much better as Lily's thrashing made precision near impossible. The kitchen counter told the tale of my failures. Spilled powder, splashes of water, a clean bottle knocked onto its side, and the remnants of my first two attempts mingling in a sad puddle. I was a man accustomed to tracking outlaws through mountain passes, to surviving on hardtack and jerky for weeks at a time. Yet here I stood, utterly defeated by the simple task of preparing an infant's meal. I didn't hear the front door open over Lily's cries, but suddenly Clara was there, unwrapping her scarf as she took in the chaotic scene. To her credit, she didn't laugh or even smile at my predicament, though Lord knows she'd have been justified. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said simply, setting down her belongings and washing her hands at the pump sink. Without comment on the mess I'd made, she stepped in beside me, taking the bottle and measuring spoon from my fumbling grasp. "Here, let me show you again," she said, her voice carrying over Lily's cries but without a hint of condescension. Her movements were precise and efficient as she demonstrated one level scoop for each 2 ounces of water, shaken until dissolved completely. I watched intently, determined to master this basic skill that had thus far eluded me. Clara warmed the bottle by setting it in a pan of hot water from the kettle, testing the temperature on her wrist in a gesture I'd seen her perform dozens of times but had failed to replicate properly myself. "You're good with her," I admitted grudgingly, still bouncing Lily, who had begun to hiccup between cries. "Better than I'll ever be." Clara looked up from testing the milk, her expression thoughtful. To my surprise, she reached out and touched my arm gently, the first time she'd initiated contact since our arrangement began. "Baby sense fear, Jedediah," she said softly. "She doesn't need your expertise, she needs your confidence." She took Lily from me, settled her briefly against her shoulder, then placed her back in my arms, adjusting my hold with gentle hands. "There, she just wants to know she's safe with you." Clara guided the bottle to Lily's mouth, but it was my hand that held it as the baby eagerly began to suck, her cries ceasing immediately. Her tiny fingers curled against the glass, and her eyes, those McKenzie blue eyes, locked onto mine with an expression of absolute trust that humbled me to my core. I looked up to thank Clara and found her watching us, her face closer than I'd expected. Our eyes met over Lily's head, and something passed between us. Something warm and dangerous and achingly familiar. For a moment, neither of us breathed, caught in a recognition of all that had been and all that might still be. Clara broke the connection first, stepping back and busying herself with wiping up the spilled milk. "You're learning quickly," she said, her voice not quite steady. "She'll be walking before you know it, and then you'll really have your hands full." I nodded, unable to form a proper response as I watched her move about the kitchen, restoring order with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. The moment had passed, but something had shifted between us, subtle as a change in the wind before a storm. As Lily's eyes drifted closed, milk-drunk and content in my arms, I found myself wondering just how many more of these moments I could endure before the careful walls we'd built came tumbling down around us. Chapter 4. Thawing Hearts. The Timber Creek schoolhouse had been transformed for the evening's Christmas pageant. Pine boughs and red ribbons adorned the windows, and dozens of candles cast a warm, golden glow throughout the room. I sat stiffly at the back, Lily perched on my knee in a tiny dress that Clara had sewn from scraps of blue calico, finished with white lace at the collar and cuffs. My niece had grown plumper these past weeks, her cheeks now round and rosy, a testament to Clara's constant care. The room overflowed with families, the wooden benches brought from the church groaning under the weight of proud parents and siblings. The air was thick with the mingled scents of wool coats, cinnamon, and the sharp tang of pine, all warmed by the pot-bellied stove that glowed cherry red in the corner. Children's excited whispers filled the room as they waited behind a makeshift curtain strung across the front of the classroom. Mrs. Abernathy leaned across the aisle toward me, her round face beaming. "First Christmas pageant, little Lily?" she cooed, reaching out to chuck the baby under her chin. "Won't be your last in Timber Creek, I'd wager." Before I could correct her assumption of permanence, Clara stepped to the front of the room, silencing the crowd with her raised hands. She wore a dress of deep green wool that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, which was swept up more elegantly than usual, with a few artful tendrils framing her face. "Welcome, friends and neighbors," she began, her clear voice carrying to the farthest corner. "Tonight, our children present the story of the first Christmas, a humble reminder of God's greatest gift to us all." As Clara introduced the production, I found my gaze fixed on her rather than on the excited children shuffling into position. The lamplight caught in her hair, turning it to burnished copper, and her eyes shone with pride as she spoke of her students' hard work. This was Clara in her element, poised, confident, beloved by the community she served so faithfully. The pageant began with young Tommy Fletcher as Joseph, leading Mary, played by shy Betsy Miller, down the center aisle. What followed was the familiar nativity story, performed with the earnest enthusiasm that only children can muster. Some fumbled their lines, others spoke too softly to be heard beyond the first row, and at one point a shepherd's crook nearly toppled a carefully arranged stable scene. Throughout it all, Clara stood to the side, mouthing encouragement when a child faltered, quietly prompting forgotten lines, her expression radiating such genuine pride that even I couldn't help smiling. When 8-year-old Sophia Jensen froze mid-verse, Clara caught her eye and nodded encouragingly, mouthing the words until the girl found her voice again. "She's a natural with them," Mrs. Abernathy whispered, following my gaze. "Born to be a mother, that one." Her words struck a chord somewhere deep inside me, conjuring unbidden visions of what might have been had I not walked away 5 years ago. I quickly refocused on the pageant, where 3 solemn boys in paper crowns were presenting their gifts to the Christ child, a rag doll wrapped in white. As the performance drew to a close, the children assembled at the front to sing a final carol. Their young voices rose in somewhat uneven harmony, filling the schoolhouse with the familiar notes of Silent Night. Lily, who had been remarkably quiet throughout the performance, suddenly reached toward the singing children, her tiny face alight with wonder at the sound. Without thinking, I stood and lifted her higher so she could see better, her little body warm and solid against my chest. As the children began the second verse, I felt a gaze upon us and turned slightly to find Clara looking back from her position near the front. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and something passed between us. A shared appreciation of Lily's joy, perhaps, or something deeper neither of us was ready to name. Clara smiled then, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and warmed something long frozen inside me. I found myself smiling back, not the guarded half-smile I'd cultivated these past weeks, but something real and unguarded. It felt like the first genuine thaw in the ice between us since I'd returned to Timber Creek. The moment held as the children's voices swelled around us, and for the first time in years, I felt the true spirit of Christmas. Not just duty and remembrance, but hope. Dangerous as it might be, hope. Christmas Day dawned clear and bracingly cold, the kind of Wyoming morning where the air itself seems crystallized, each breath visible in puffs of white. I dressed Lily in her finest, the new gown Clara had finished just days before, white with tiny red stitching at the hem. My own attire was far less festive, though I'd polished my boots and pressed my good shirt for the occasion. Pastor Wells had invited us both to Christmas dinner, an invitation neither of us could politely refuse given all he'd done to help with our situation. The thought of spending the holiday in Clara's company away from the buffer of Lily's care set my nerves jangling like loose spurs. "You look mighty fine today, Miss Lily," I told my niece as I wrapped her in the rabbit fur-lined blanket Mr. Fletcher had contributed to her growing collection of gifts from the townsfolk. "Pretty as a picture, just like your mama must have been." The mention of Sarah, a woman I'd never met, brought a familiar pang. I'd failed my brother in life, unable to bridge the divide the war had created between us. The least I could do was honor his memory by caring for his child. The walk to the parsonage was short, the packed snow crunching beneath my boots as Lily babbled contentedly in my arms. Smoke curled from the chimney of the small but tidy house behind the church, and the windows glowed with welcoming light. The scent of roasting turkey and cinnamon greeted us as Pastor Wells opened the door to my knock. "Brother McKenzie and little Miss Lily, come in," he boomed, his round face ruddy with Christmas cheer. "Clara arrived just moments ago. Let me take your coat." I surrendered my outer garments and followed him into the parlor, where a fire crackled merrily in the hearth. A modest tree stood in the corner, decorated with paper chains, pine cones, and a few precious glass ornaments. Clara sat on the settee beside the elderly Hargrave sisters, who immediately began cooing over Lily when they spotted us. "Let me hold the precious lamb," Miss Esther Hargrave insisted, her gnarled hands reaching for the baby despite her sister's protests that she'd had her turn at church last Sunday. I relinquished Lily somewhat reluctantly, knowing from experience how the sisters could monopolize her given half a chance. Clara caught my eye over Miss Esther's head and offered a small, commiserating smile that eased some of my discomfort. "Ranger McKenzie," she greeted me formally, though her tone held less reserve than in weeks past. "Merry Christmas." "Miss Holloway," I returned with a nod. "Merry Christmas to you as well." Before our stilted exchange could continue, Pastor Wells ushered in his final guest, Thomas Langdon, a young widower who'd recently taken over the town's mercantile. Langdon was everything I was not: educated, well-spoken, and dressed in a fine tailored suit that had clearly never seen the inside of a general store's ready-made section. "Miss Holloway," Langdon said warmly, taking Clara's hand and holding it perhaps a moment longer than strictly proper. "A pleasure to see you outside of school board meetings." Clara's cheeks colored slightly as she withdrew her hand. "Mr. Langdon, I didn't realize you would be joining us." "The pastor was kind enough to include me, knowing I've no family nearby," Langdon explained, settling himself beside Clara on the settee with a familiarity that set my teeth on edge. "Though I'm hardly alone in that circumstance in these territories." Throughout the elaborate dinner that followed, turkey with all the fixings, cranberry sauce that must have been shipped at great expense from back east, and 3 different kinds of pie, I found myself growing increasingly irritated with Langdon's attentions to Clara. He drew her into conversations about books I'd never read, referenced places back east I'd never seen, and worst of all, repeatedly made her laugh with clever observations that highlighted the vast gulf between his polished manners and my rough ways. "Boston at Christmas is something to behold," he was saying now, leaning closer to Clara than necessary to pass the potatoes. "The carol singers in the common, the shop windows all decorated. Perhaps someday you might see it again." "It's been many years since I left Massachusetts," Clara replied, her expression softening with reminiscence. "Though I don't regret my decision to come west." "No regrets at all," Langdon pressed, his tone suggesting he found that hard to believe. I stabbed at my turkey with unnecessary force, drawing a sharp look from Miss Agnes Hargrave across the table. Beside me, Pastor Wells cleared his throat, his gaze moving meaningfully between my scowling face and Langdon's attentive posture toward Clara. "Brother McKenzie," the pastor said with deliberate cheer, "did you know Mr. Langdon is quite interested in expanding the mercantile's selection of hunting supplies? Perhaps you could advise him on what our local sportsmen require." The conversation shifted, but my discomfort lingered through the meal. The realization that I had no claim on Clara, that she was free to find happiness with someone more suitable than a scarred ex-soldier turned ranger, sat like a stone in my gut. After dinner, when we had returned to the parlor for coffee, Pastor Wells announced it was time for gift exchanges. The Hargrave sisters presented Lily with a handmade quilt, Langdon offered the pastor a fine leather-bound book, and several other small tokens were exchanged among the gathering. To my surprise, Clara withdrew a package from her reticule and approached where I stood by the fireplace. "It isn't much," she said, her voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. "For your patrols." I unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a finely knit scarf in a deep blue that nearly matched Lily's and my own eyes. The wool was soft but sturdy, the stitches even and tight, clearly the work of many evenings. "You made this?" I asked, running a thumb over the careful pattern. "It's practical," she said, her gaze fixed somewhere near my collar rather than meeting my eyes. "The winters are hard on the high trails." The thought of Clara spending hours creating something for me, regardless of how practical the gift might be, caused a tightness in my chest I couldn't name. With fumbling fingers, I reached into my pocket and withdrew the small package I'd been carrying all day, uncertain until this moment whether I'd find the courage to give it. "I have something for you as well," I said, extending the awkwardly wrapped parcel. Clara's surprise was evident as she accepted it, carefully untying the string and folding back the paper. Inside lay a silver hairpin, simple but elegant, with a small pearl set at one end. "I noticed you lost yours," I explained hastily, suddenly feeling foolish for the personal nature of the gift. "When we were setting up the Christmas tree. Your hair kept falling. That is, I saw it was bothering you and thought—" I trailed off, acutely aware of how closely Pastor Wells was watching our exchange, despite his pretense of being engaged in conversation with Langdon. Clara looked up, her fingers curled protectively around the hairpin. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's lovely, Jedediah." The use of my given name, spoken in that gentle tone, affected me more than seemed reasonable. We stood in awkward silence until Lily, perhaps sensing the tension, began to fuss in Miss Esther's arms. I moved to retrieve her, grateful for the distraction. As I settled Lily against my shoulder, I caught Clara's reflection in the window glass. She had stepped aside slightly and was running her finger over the pearl of the hairpin, an expression on her face I couldn't quite decipher, something between wonder and wariness, as if she too recognized that something fundamental had shifted between us. Pastor Wells appeared at my elbow, ostensibly to check on Lily, but with a knowing gleam in his eye that made me uncomfortably aware of how transparent my feelings must be. "Remarkable how the right gifts reveal what's truly in the heart, isn't it?" he murmured, before moving away to refill the sisters' coffee cups. I had no answer for him then, but as I watched Clara carefully pin back a stray lock of hair with my gift, I knew one thing with certainty. The wall of ice I'd built between us 5 years ago was melting, whether I willed it or not. The question remained whether what lay beneath was sturdy enough to build upon, or merely shifting sand that would crumble under the weight of all we'd left unspoken for so long. Sleep eluded me on New Year's Eve, though not for lack of trying. Outside, the temperature had plummeted, causing the timber frame of the Jensen house to creak and settle in protest. I'd banked the fire high before retiring, but the chill still found its way beneath my quilt, a reminder of winter's grip on the Wyoming territory. After an hour of restless tossing, I surrendered to wakefulness and pulled on my trousers and shirt. The floorboards felt like ice beneath my stocking feet as I made my way to Lily's room to check on her. To my surprise, a faint glow spilled from the partially open door. I pushed it wider to find Clara kneeling beside the cradle, tucking the blanket more securely around Lily's sleeping form. She'd taken to stopping by most evenings after supper to help with Lily's bedtime routine, but she usually left directly after. Tonight she remained, wrapped in a heavy shawl over her nightdress and wrapper, her hair hanging in a loose braid down her back. She looked up at my entrance, seeming neither startled nor embarrassed to be caught in my home so late. "I couldn't sleep," she explained softly. I kept thinking about her, alone in this cold room. "She's not alone," I said, moving to stand beside the cradle. "I check on her through the night." Lily slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled beside her cheek, her chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of innocent slumber. In the candlelight, the resemblance to Matthew was striking. The same set of the brow, the same curve of the lip. My brother lived on in this child in ways I hadn't anticipated. "The fire in the front room is still up," I said, surprised at my own boldness. "Would you care to sit a while? It's warmer there." Clara hesitated only briefly before nodding. I stepped back to allow her to pass, catching the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to linger around her. We moved to the front room where the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, the windows dark with the moonless night beyond. Clara settled on one end of the small sofa I'd acquired from Widow Jansen's estate sale, while I took the rocking chair opposite. For long minutes we sat in silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional pop from the fireplace. It struck me that this was the first time since my return that we'd willingly spent time alone together, without Lily as a buffer between us. The flamelight softened Clara's features, bringing a warm glow to her complexion and highlighting the auburn undertones in her hair. She'd changed in the 5 years since I'd left. There was a self-possession about her now, a quiet dignity, that hadn't been there before. She'd been a girl when I left. She was unquestionably a woman now. "You never gave me a reason," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "5 years ago. You just walked away." The abrupt broaching of the subject we'd both so carefully avoided startled me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Clara had never been one to shy away from difficult truths, even before I'd broken her heart. I stared into the flames, feeling the weight of her gaze upon me, but unable to meet it. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, growing wider with each tick of the clock. I knew she deserved an answer, had deserved one 5 years ago, but the words stuck in my throat, gnarled and painful. When I remained silent, she spoke again, her voice steady despite the emotion I could hear beneath it. "I thought perhaps there was someone else, or that I'd somehow failed you. For years I've wondered what I might have done differently." "No," I said quickly, the word wrenched from me by the thought of her blaming herself all this time. "There was never anyone else, nor could there be." "Then why?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly. "We were to be married in the spring. Everything was arranged. Then you returned from that trip to Cheyenne and suddenly claimed it was all a mistake. What happened, Jedediah?" I ran a hand through my hair, searching for words to explain what I scarcely understood myself some days. When I finally spoke, my voice emerged rough with emotion, long suppressed. "I saw a man in Cheyenne, a soldier I'd fought alongside at Antietam." The memory rose vivid and unwelcome. Powell standing outside the land office, his once handsome face now twisted with scars, his empty sleeve pinned neatly to his side. He didn't recognize me at first. When he did, he introduced me to his wife. The way she looked at him, like he was half a man, like she was making the best of a bad bargain. I paused, gathering courage to continue. That night, the nightmares came back worse than ever. All the things I saw during the war, all the things I did. My hands tightened on the arms of the rocking chair. Men torn apart by cannon fire, boys drowning in their own blood, calling for their mamas, and me, killing because those were my orders. Because if I didn't shoot first, they'd shoot me. I risked a glance at Clara. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes never leaving mine as I spoke of horrors I'd kept locked inside for years. "I couldn't taint someone like you with those shadows," I continued, the words coming easier now that I'd begun. "You deserved better than a broken man who wakes up shouting in the night, who sees death in every shadow. Someone who could give you a real life, not one haunted by ghosts." Clara was silent for so long I thought perhaps I'd finally succeeded in driving her away for good. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning around the eaves like a soul in torment. In the distance, the church bell began to toll the midnight hour, marking the arrival of 1879. As the last bell faded, Clara rose from the sofa and crossed the small space between us. To my astonishment, she reached for my hand, her fingers warm and sure as they closed around mine. "It wasn't your choice to make alone, Jedediah," she said softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "God doesn't promise us unwounded hearts, just the grace to heal together." The simple truth of her words struck me with the force of revelation. All these years, I'd thought I was protecting her by leaving. Instead, I denied us both the chance to face our wounds together, hers from losing her parents, mine from the war, and find healing in shared strength. Her hand remained in mine as the New Year's first moments ticked by, neither of us speaking, but something profound passing between us nonetheless. When she finally withdrew it to adjust her shawl, the loss of contact felt physical, as if a part of me went with her. "I should return home," she said, though she made no move toward the door. "The hour is late," I observed, rising from my chair, "and the temperature has dropped considerably." She nodded, gathering her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "I'll check on Lily once more before I go." I followed her to the doorway of the small bedroom where my niece slept on, blissfully unaware of the shift in the world around her. We stood together in the doorframe, watching her sleep, and I was struck by how right it felt to have Clara beside me in this moment, as if the three of us formed a complete circle that had only been broken temporarily. "Happy New Year, Jedediah," Clara whispered before slipping out into the cold night, leaving me to wonder if the dawn of 1879 might indeed bring something worth celebrating at last. January settled over Timber Creek like a heavy blanket, the days short and the nights bitter cold. Yet within the confines of that frozen month, something new began to bloom between Clara and me. Tentative and fragile as the first crocus pushing through snow, but undeniable all the same. Our days fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Mornings found Clara at the schoolhouse, her students lined in neat rows, reciting their lessons while Lily napped in a cradle positioned beside her desk. I'd catch glimpses of this domestic tableau when returning from short patrols, pausing sometimes at the schoolhouse window to watch Clara move among her pupils, offering praise here, correction there, always with the same patient grace. "Mr. McKenzie, are you coming inside or just decorating my porch?" she called one particularly cold afternoon, having spotted me through the glass. The children giggled as I stamped snow from my boots and entered, hat in hand. "Just passing by to see if you needed more firewood," I explained, though we both knew my patrol route could have taken me elsewhere. "As it happens, we're running low," she replied, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement. "Perhaps you could demonstrate proper wood-chopping technique for the older boys before you collect Lily." Such moments became more frequent. Practical reasons to spend time in each other's company, always with Lily as our ostensible focus. I found myself lingering at the schoolhouse after collecting my niece, helping Clara straighten desks or sweep floors. Sometimes she would accompany us back to the Jensen house, claiming Lily needed the comfort of her familiar presence. On days when the weather confined me to town, I would often work around the property with Lily, watching from a basket lined with quilts. She'd grown fascinated with movement and sound, her blue eyes tracking me as I split logs or repaired loose shingles, her tiny mittened hands clapping with delight at the sharp crack of the axe meeting wood. "She's going to be an outdoors woman like her uncle," Clara observed one afternoon, appearing with a steaming cup of coffee that she pressed into my cold hands. "She hasn't taken her eyes off you once." "Takes after her pa in that regard," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Matthew could never sit still indoors, even as a boy. Where once the mention of my brother would have been accompanied by a stab of guilt, I now found I could speak of him more freely. Especially to Clara. She had a way of listening that invited confidences, her expression neither pitying nor judgmental as I shared memories long buried. Wednesday evenings found us at prayer meeting, seated together in a pew with Lily between us. Pastor Wells never commented on this development directly, though his sermons seemed increasingly focused on themes of redemption and second chances. The first time Clara's hand accidentally brushed mine while reaching to adjust Lily's blanket, neither of us pulled away immediately, and I felt the contact like a brand against my skin. "The Lord often works in ways we don't expect," Pastor Wells said meaningfully after one such service, his gaze moving between us as we gathered our things to leave. "Sometimes the path home is longer than we anticipated, but no less true for the journey." Our evenings together lengthened as January progressed. What began as brief handovers of Lily evolved into shared suppers, which in turn became quiet hours by the fire after Lily had been put to bed. One such evening, Clara brought a book of poetry and read aloud while I whittled a small wooden horse for Lily. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul," she read, her voice soft in the firelit room, "and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all." I looked up from my carving to find her watching me, the open book forgotten in her lap. Something passed between us then, something unspoken but profoundly understood. The distance between us on the sofa seemed suddenly both too great and not great enough. The moment broke when Lily called out from her room, but the feeling lingered long after Clara had said her goodbyes and returned to her own home. That night, for the first time in years, I dreamed not of battlefields, but of a future filled with quiet evenings and shared laughter. Of course, such changes did not go unnoticed in a town the size of Timber Creek. The gossip spread like wildfire, fueled by each public sighting of us together. I overheard snippets of conversation at the general store, in the post office, even outside the barber shop where I stopped for a monthly trim. "Knew they'd find their way back to each other," Mrs. Abernathy declared to anyone who would listen. "Some things are just meant to be, mark my words." Her husband nodded sagely. "Ranger's settled down right proper with that baby. Makes a man reconsider his priorities, having someone depending on him." Clara bore the speculation with better grace than I did, simply changing the subject when questioned directly about our arrangement. Lily is fortunate to have so many in town who care for her welfare, she would say, neatly redirecting the conversation. The height of the town's presumption came one bitter cold Tuesday when I entered the Mercantile to purchase coffee and found Mrs. Abernathy and 3 other ladies from the Ladies' Aid Society clustered around bolts of fabric. "Too dark for a spring wedding," Mrs. Abernathy was saying, holding a length of navy silk against her ample bosom. "But I've had this put aside since before Christmas. With some cream lace at the collar, it would be just the thing for the mother of the groom." Or, close enough, considering. The women fell silent as they noticed me, exchanging meaningful glances before Mrs. Abernathy approached with determined cheer. "Ranger McKenzie, just the man we were discussing," she announced, apparently unconcerned with subtlety. "We were wondering if you and Miss Holloway had set a date yet. The church books fill up quickly for spring weddings, you know." I felt heat creep up my neck as I fumbled for a response. "Ma'am, I think you misunderstand. Miss Holloway and I are merely caring for Lily together. There's been no discussion of, that is to say, we haven't." Mrs. Abernathy patted my arm indulgently. "Of course, Ranger, just caring for the child. That's why you've been seen walking her home every evening and why she wears your mother's hairpin every Sunday." I left the store in a state of confusion, having forgotten entirely what I'd come to purchase. The assumptions of the townspeople were presumptuous, to be sure, but more disturbing was my own reaction to them. Not outrage or denial, but a quiet, persistent hope that their predictions might someday prove true. That evening, when Clara arrived to help with Lily's bath, I found myself studying her with new eyes, noting the way she'd taken to wearing the silver hairpin every day, not just Sundays, and how her smile came more readily now when our eyes met. The physical and emotional distance between us had decreased so gradually I'd hardly noticed it happening, like snow melting imperceptibly under spring sunshine. "Is something the matter?" she asked, catching me watching her as she tucked Lily into her cradle. "Nothing at all," I replied, though my heart thundered in my chest like a stampede. "Just thinking that some changes come on so slow, a man hardly notices until they're already complete." Clara's expression softened with understanding. "And some changes have been waiting to happen for a very long time," she said quietly, "just biding their time until the season was right." In that moment, with winter still holding firm outside, but the promise of spring stirring somewhere deep beneath the snow, I began to believe that perhaps the town gossips weren't entirely wrong after all. Chapter 5: Gathering Clouds. February arrived with a brief thaw that turned Timber Creek streets to a quagmire of half-frozen mud and slush. The children tracked it into the schoolhouse daily, creating endless work for Clara, who insisted on maintaining her standards of cleanliness despite the challenges of the season. I'd taken to escorting Lily to school most mornings rather than having Clara fetch her, telling myself it was merely to spare her the difficult walk in treacherous conditions. On the morning of the 14th, I dressed Lily with particular care, selecting the red woolen dress Clara had sewn for her and combing her fine hair, which had begun to grow in thicker, revealing hints of Matthew's sandy brown. In her basket, wrapped carefully in tissue paper I'd begged from Mrs. Abernathy, lay a small token I wasn't entirely sure I should deliver. "This is between us, Miss Lily," I told my niece as we made our way through town. "No need for anyone to know your uncle's gone soft in the head." The schoolhouse windows glowed golden against the gray morning, smoke curling from the chimney into the pewter sky. Inside, Clara's students were already settled at their desks, an unusual hush of anticipation hanging in the air. I hung back in the doorway, Lily in my arms, suddenly self-conscious about the small package in her basket. "Ranger McKenzie," Clara greeted me with obvious surprise. "I didn't expect you this morning." "Thought I'd save you the trip," I mumbled, unable to meet her eyes directly. The children were watching us with undisguised interest, several giggling behind their hands. Clara seemed about to say more when young Tommy Fletcher sprang to his feet. "Miss Holloway, can we give them to you now?" Clara turned to her students with a bemused smile. "I suppose this is as good a time as any." At her words, the children erupted into motion. each producing carefully crafted paper hearts and cards from their desks. They formed a line before Clara's desk, presenting their valentines one by one with solemn ceremony. "Happy Valentine's Day, Miss Holloway," each child said in turn, offering creations of varying sophistication, from simple cutout hearts to elaborate confections of lace paper and ribbons, likely assisted by maternal hands. Clara received each offering with genuine appreciation, thanking the children individually and setting the valentines carefully on her desk. Her cheeks had flushed a becoming pink, her eyes bright with pleasure at the unexpected display of affection. I shifted uncomfortably by the door, wondering if I'd made a terrible miscalculation. These paper hearts and declarations of fondness were children's tokens, innocent and expected. What I'd prepared suddenly seemed presumptuous, even inappropriate. Before I could retreat, however, Clara looked up and caught my eye. "I believe Lily is fidgeting quite a bit, Ranger McKenzie. Perhaps she has something to say as well." The children turned as one to look at me, their expressions expectant. I felt heat creep up my neck as I stepped forward, clearing my throat. "It seems Lily wanted to participate," I said gruffly, retrieving the small package from her basket, though her penmanship leaves something to be desired. Clara accepted the tissue-wrapped token, her fingers brushing mine in a contact that sent an inexplicable shiver up my arm. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a simple card of heavy cream stock, adorned only with a small red heart I'd cut from scraps of Lily's dress. Inside, pressed carefully in black ink, was Lily's tiny handprint. "Oh," Clara breathed, her eyes widening as she traced the outline of the diminutive fingers with her own. This is lovely." The children crowded around to see, exclaiming over how tiny Lily's hand was and how clever it was to make a valentine this way. In the commotion, Clara glanced up at me, a question in her eyes that I couldn't quite interpret. "Children, please return to your seats and take out your primers," she instructed, her voice steady though her cheeks remained flushed. "We'll display all the valentines at lunchtime." As the students settled, Clara stepped closer, Lily's valentine still in her hand. "You made this," she said softly, not a question but a statement. I shrugged, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "Weren't much trouble, just thought the little ones should participate, is all." "It's the most thoughtful gift I've received today," she replied, her voice carrying a warmth that belied my casual dismissal. "Thank you, Jedediah." Something in her expression, a softness, an openness I hadn't seen in years, made my heart stutter in my chest. For a moment, the schoolroom faded away, and I was back 5 years ago, standing on the church steps with this woman's hand in mine, the future stretching before us bright with promise. The sound of horses and carriage wheels, unusual for a mid-morning arrival in our small town. Clara's brow furrowed as she moved to the window. "A proper carriage," she observed, peering out. "With matched grays, no less. That's not local." My curiosity piqued. I joined her at the window, Lily still in my arms. Through the wavy glass, I could make out an elegant black carriage drawing to a halt before the schoolhouse, its polished surface gleaming despite the mud splattered on its lower panels. The team of gray horses steamed in the cold air, clearly having been driven at speed. The door opened, and a man stepped down, tall, well-dressed in a manner that spoke of eastern cities and substantial means. His greatcoat was of fine wool, his boots polished leather that had likely never seen ranch work. He turned to assist a woman from the carriage, her attire equally refined, a traveling suit of deep blue trimmed with fur at the collar and cuffs, her hat secured with a matching veil. "I wonder what brings such visitors to Timber Creek," Clara murmured, a note of concern in her voice. "And to the schoolhouse, of all places." Before I could respond, the strangers approached the door, the man rapping firmly with a gloved hand. Clara smoothed her skirts and moved to answer, composing her features into the pleasant expression she reserved for parents and town officials. "May I help you?" she inquired, opening the door just enough to address them without letting in the cold air. "I certainly hope so," the man replied, his accent refined but with the faintest hint of a southern drawl. "I apologize for the interruption. I am Edward Harrington, and this is my wife, Victoria. We've come from St. Louis on a matter of some urgency." Clara opened the door wider, her natural hospitality overcoming any misgivings. "Please, come in out of the cold. I am Miss Holloway, the teacher here." The couple stepped inside, bringing with them the sense of expensive cologne and leather, at odds with the simple surroundings of the schoolroom. Mrs. Harrington lowered her veil, revealing a face of mature beauty, her complexion unmarred by the harsh sun and wind that weathered most women in the territory. "We've been traveling for some weeks now," she explained, her voice cultured and soft, "following information that has led us from settlement to settlement." Mr. Harrington removed his hat, revealing hair as dark as his wife's was fair, though both were threaded with silver at the temples. His gaze moved around the room, taking in the curious children before settling on me, or rather, on Lily in my arms. "We're searching for our niece," he explained, his posture straightening with purpose. "Our sister Sarah's child. We received word only recently of Sarah's passing and that of her husband. The child, we're told, was placed with a relative on the father's side, somewhere in this territory." At the mention of Sarah's name, I felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath me. My arms tightened instinctively around Lily, who sensed my tension and began to fuss. Clara's gaze darted to my face, clearly noting my reaction. "Sarah?" I repeated, the name tasting strange on my tongue. "Your sister's name was Sarah?" Victoria Harrington's eyes fixed on Lily with sudden intensity. "Sarah Harrington McKenzie," she confirmed, stepping closer. "Our younger sister. She married a man named Matthew McKenzie against our parents' wishes some years ago. We lost touch after they moved west." Her voice wavered slightly. "We've been trying to locate them for some time, only to learn of their tragic deaths." The room seemed to tilt around me as the implications sank in. These elegant strangers claimed to be Lily's family, her blood kin, with more right to her than I had as merely her uncle. I'd come to think of Lily as mine, had begun to build a life around her care, had even allowed myself to imagine a future where she would grow up calling me Pa. "I'm Jedediah McKenzie," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Matthew was my brother." The Harringtons exchanged a quick glance fraught with meaning I couldn't decipher. Then Edward Harrington extended his hand, his expression composed into appropriate solemnity. "Then it seems Providence has guided us true," he said. "We've found our niece at last." Clara moved to stand beside me, her presence steady and reassuring. "This is quite unexpected," she said, her tone politely neutral, though I could hear the tension beneath. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. The children have their lessons." "Of course," Mrs. Harrington agreed, though her eyes never left Lily. "We've taken rooms at the hotel in town. Perhaps you might join us there to discuss the matter further?" I nodded stiffly, unable to form a proper response as my mind raced with implications and questions. Lily, sensing the tension, began to cry in earnest now, her small face scrunching in distress. "The child seems upset," Mrs. Harrington observed, reaching toward Lily as if to take her. "May I?" I stepped back instinctively, an action I couldn't have explained if pressed. Something primitive and protective rose in me, a certainty that I should not relinquish Lily to these strangers, regardless of their claims. "She's not accustomed to new faces," Clara interjected smoothly, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "Perhaps later, when she's calmer." Mrs. Harrington withdrew her hand, her expression unreadable behind the mask of genteel civility. "Of course. How thoughtless of me." "This afternoon, then?" Mr. Harrington suggested, replacing his hat. "At the hotel? We have much to discuss about the child's future." The word future sent a chill through me unlike anything the Wyoming winter had conjured. I found myself unable to speak, fear and anger and confusion warring within me. 3:00, Clara answered for me, her voice steady when mine was not. "We'll come then." The Harringtons took their leave with formal politeness, though I noted how Mrs. Harrington's gaze lingered on Lily until the door closed behind them. Only when the sound of carriage wheels faded did I realize I'd been holding my breath. "Jedediah," Clara said softly, turning to face me, "are they truly—" "I don't know," I interrupted, my voice rough with emotion I couldn't name. "Sarah's family disowned her for marrying Matthew. He told me that much in his letters. Said they were high society in St. Louis, thought she was throwing herself away on a rancher's son." Lily continued to fuss, sensing my agitation. Clara gently took her from my arms, soothing her with practiced ease. "Regardless of who they are," she said, her voice low to avoid the children's curious ears, "they've clearly come with purpose. We need to understand what they want." What they wanted seemed all too clear to me. They wanted Lily, the last connection to their sister, perhaps to assuage guilt over years of estrangement. The thought of losing her twisted in my gut like a knife. "Go home and collect yourself," Clara advised, noting my distress. "I'll meet you at 2:30 and we'll go to the hotel together." I nodded, suddenly desperate for air and space to think. As I turned to leave, Clara caught my arm, her expression earnest. "Jedediah," she said, the valentine still clutched in her free hand, "whatever happens, we'll face it together." The simple declaration steadied me, offering a lifeline in waters that had suddenly turned treacherous. I covered her hand briefly with my own, a wordless acknowledgement of all she offered, before stepping back out into the gray February day. A day that had begun with such promise and now loomed heavy with uncertainty. The meeting at the hotel the previous afternoon had been brief and formal, with the Harringtons requesting we convene at the sheriff's office the following day to review their documentation. I'd spent a sleepless night pacing the small confines of the Jensen house, Lily's peaceful slumber in stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside me. By dawn, my eyes felt gritty from exhaustion, my mind no clearer despite hours of wrestling with the situation. Sheriff Taylor's office smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the particular blend of coffee and tobacco that seemed to follow the man himself. The room was small but tidy, dominated by a scarred oak desk and a pot-bellied stove that struggled to dispel the February chill. A Wyoming territorial flag hung limply from a wooden pole in the corner, its colors muted by years of dust and smoke. The Harringtons arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, dressed as formally as if attending court in St. Louis rather than meeting in a frontier sheriff's office. Mrs. Harrington's gloved hand rested lightly on her husband's arm as they entered, her poise never faltering despite the muddy threshold and uneven floorboards. I'd left Lily with the Hargrave sisters, unwilling to bring her into what promised to be a tense encounter. Clara stood beside me, her quiet presence a balm to my frayed nerves. She'd arranged for a substitute teacher, sacrificing her day's wages to accompany me, a gesture that spoke volumes about her commitment to Lily, to us. "Well now," Sheriff Taylor began, settling his considerable bulk behind the desk and gesturing for us all to take seats on the mismatched chairs before him. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington have requested this meeting to present certain documentation regarding the child currently in your care, Ranger McKenzie." Edward Harrington opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents, each carefully preserved despite the rigors of travel. "Sheriff Taylor, we appreciate your time in this delicate matter," he said, his cultured voice at odds with the frontier setting. "As we explained yesterday, my wife and I have only recently learned of our sister's passing and of the existence of her child." Victoria Harrington's gloved hands twisted slightly in her lap, the only outward sign of emotion in her carefully composed demeanor. "Sarah was 7 years my junior," she said, addressing her words to Clara rather than to me. "She left home, impulsively, with Mr. Mackenzie's brother when she was barely 19. Our parents were devastated. They made attempts to reconcile, but Sarah refused all contact." "How convenient that you've suddenly developed familial feeling now that your parents are no longer in the picture," I said, the words escaping before I could temper them with civility. "Jedediah," Clara murmured, laying a warning hand on my arm. Edward Harrington's expression tightened momentarily before he regained his composure. "Your skepticism is understandable, Mr. Mackenzie. Estrangement is a terrible thing, especially when death removes any chance of reconciliation. That's precisely why we're determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past with our niece." He passed the first document to Sheriff Taylor, a birth certificate for Sarah Elizabeth Harrington, followed by a marriage certificate recording her union with Matthew James Mackenzie. Next came a collection of letters, creased and worn. "These are the letters Sarah sent to Victoria, secretly, against our parents' wishes," Harrington explained. "The last one, dated just over a year ago, mentions her pregnancy and her hopes for the child." I stared at the familiar handwriting on the envelopes, addressed to Mrs. V. Harrington, at a St. Louis address. The knowledge that Matthew's wife had maintained some connection with her family, a connection my brother had never mentioned, felt like a betrayal, however irrational. "May I?" Clara asked, reaching for one of the letters after Sheriff Taylor had examined it. Victoria Harrington nodded. "In the last letter, she speaks of the baby. A girl, she hoped. Clara opened the folded paper carefully, her eyes scanning the faded ink. She mentions feeling the baby move for the first time, she said softly, and how Matthew built a cradle from pine like his father had done for him. The intimate detail, one I hadn't known, struck me like a physical blow. That cradle now sat in my home, holding Lily each night. My brother's handiwork, his legacy. Edward Harrington produced a final document, this one bearing an official seal. This letter from Territorial Judge William Hanson confirms our legal right as blood relatives to assume custody of our niece in the absence of a formal will from either parent. Sheriff Taylor adjusted his spectacles, reading the document with deliberate care. His weathered face betrayed nothing as he studied the legal language, though a slight furrowing of his brow suggested he found no fault with the claims presented. "Everything appears to be in order," he finally said, looking up at me with genuine regret in his eyes. "According to territorial law, in the absence of specified guardianship in a will, blood relatives on either side have equal claim. However, the judge's letter gives precedence to maternal relatives when paternal relatives are unmarried males, particularly in the case of a female child." I felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor beneath me had suddenly become unstable. "That's Lily's future decided on the scratch of a pen?" I demanded, my voice rough with emotion. "By a judge who's never laid eyes on her, or on these people claiming to be her family." "Mr. Mackenzie," Victoria Harrington said, turning to face me directly for the first time. "Please understand that we have only Lily's best interests at heart. She'll have every advantage with us, the finest schools, proper society, her mother's family heritage." Her perfectly modulated voice softened slightly. "She'll want for nothing, except love," I retorted, the words torn from some deep, wounded place inside me. "Except the knowledge of who her father was, of her Mackenzie blood. We have no intention of denying Lily her paternal heritage," Edward Harrington assured me, his tone maddeningly reasonable. "When she's older, she'll learn about her father. We would welcome correspondence, perhaps even visits when she's of an age to travel safely." Correspondence, visits. The words fell like stones, each one burying deeper the future I'd begun to imagine for Lily, for all of us. I looked to Sheriff Taylor, searching for some loophole, some reason to challenge what seemed increasingly inevitable. The sheriff closed the folder containing the documents, his expression grave. "Mr. Harrington, Mrs. Harrington, your legal claim appears sound. However, given the child's tender age and the bond she's developed with her uncle, I would suggest a gradual transition rather than an immediate transfer of custody." Victoria Harrington's lips thinned slightly at this suggestion. "While we appreciate your concerns, Sheriff, we've already secured passage east. The longer we delay, the more difficult the journey becomes with spring thaws approaching." Clara, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke. "Surely a few days wouldn't make such a difference, for Lily's sake?" Something in her gentle plea seemed to reach Victoria Harrington. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Perhaps you're right, Miss Holloway. A day or two to prepare the child would be sensible." "We plan to depart on Thursday's eastbound stage," Edward Harrington added, consulting a gold pocket watch. "Would tomorrow morning be acceptable, Mr. Mackenzie? Say 9 o'clock at the hotel?" Tomorrow. The word echoed in my mind like a death knell. I felt Clara's hand slip into mine, her fingers cold but steady. I couldn't bring myself to respond, my throat closed tight against words that would make this nightmare real. "They're offering what we cannot," Clara whispered, leaning close enough that only I could hear. Though her hands trembled in mine, betraying her distress, her voice remained level. "Perhaps this is God's provision for her." I wanted to rage against her words, against the resignation I heard in them, but looking into her eyes, I saw not surrender, but the same agonizing struggle I felt, the battle between what we wanted and what might truly be best for Lily. "I'll bring her in the morning," I finally managed, my voice hollow and unrecognizable to my own ears. "She should have one more night in the only home she's known." Victoria Harrington's expression softened marginally. "We understand this is difficult, Mr. Mackenzie. We're not unaware of the sacrifice you've made these past months, caring for her as you have." Her words, likely meant as comfort, scraped like salt in an open wound. Sacrifice implied choice, suggested nobility. What I felt for Lily wasn't sacrifice. It was love, pure and simple, growing deeper with each day I'd held her. Each night I'd soothed her cries. Each morning I'd watched her eyes light up when she saw me. Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat, compassion evident in his weathered face. If that's settled, then I believe we're finished here. I rose on legs that felt suddenly wooden, unable to look at the Harringtons as they gathered their papers. Clara's hand remained in mine as we stepped out into the cold February air, the brightness of the day a mockery of the darkness gathering inside me. Jedediah, she began, but I shook my head, unable to bear whatever comfort she might offer. I need to be alone, I said roughly. I'll collect Lily from the Hargraves and prepare her things. Clara nodded, understanding in her eyes, though she couldn't possibly comprehend the depth of what I felt. The sense that I was failing Matthew one final time. Failing the child who had become the center of my world. Failing the future I'd begun to believe might be possible. As I walked away, every step and effort against the leaden weight in my chest, I found myself praying for the first time since I was a boy. Not the careful, measured prayers I'd offered in church, but a raw, desperate plea from the depths of my soul. Lord, if you're listening, if you care at all for one broken man, please, please don't take her from me. Not Lily, not the only good thing left of my brother, not the child I've come to love as my own. But as I turned toward the Hargrave sisters' home, the cold Wyoming wind carried no answer, only the distant sound of the stagecoach arriving, the very coach that would, in 2 days' time, carry Lily away from everything and everyone she'd known, into a future I would have no part in shaping. Night fell early, as it always did in February, the darkness pressing against the window panes like a living thing seeking entry. I'd built the fire higher than usual, its golden light pushing back the shadows and warming the small front room of the Jensen house to an almost uncomfortable degree. Neither Clara nor I mentioned it. The cold was the least of our concerns on this bitter night. Lily slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware that come morning her world would change forever. I'd managed not to weep when I'd bathed her that evening, memorizing every dimple and curve of her small body. I hadn't broken when I dressed her in her nightgown, counting her tiny fingers and toes as I had that first day she arrived on my doorstep. But watching her sleep now, her rosebud mouth slightly open, one fist curled beside her cheek, threatened to undo me completely. The blue dress should go on top, Clara said softly, folding the garment she'd sewn with such care. It brings out her eyes. She knelt beside a small trunk the Harringtons had sent over, a fine piece with brass fittings, meant to transport Lily's belongings east. Clara had been methodically filling it for the past hour, each item wrapped and arranged with reverent care. Her movements were precise, deliberate, as if focusing on this task kept her from dwelling on what it signified. "Do you think they'll use any of it?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. "Or will they replace everything with fancy store-bought things as soon as they reach St. Louis?" Clara's hands stilled on the blanket she was folding. They seemed genuinely concerned for her comfort. "I believe they'll keep what matters." I nodded, unable to argue, though doubt gnawed at me. The Harringtons, with their fine clothes and Eastern manners, seemed to inhabit a different world entirely from the one where Lily had spent her first months. Would they understand what songs soothed her? Would they know she preferred to sleep with her rabbit fur blanket against her cheek? Would they recognize the first signs of her temper in the way her brow furrowed before a cry? The sheet of paper before me remained mostly blank, though I'd been attempting to write for nearly an hour. How did a man distill all he wished to say to a child who wouldn't remember him into words that might someday be read by a young woman who would be a stranger? "I don't know where to begin," I admitted, setting the pen down beside the half-empty inkwell. "What can I tell her that will matter?" Clara rose from her packing and moved to stand behind my chair, her presence a comfort, though she didn't touch me. "Tell her about Matthew and Sarah. Tell her where she comes from." I picked up the pen again, dipped it carefully in the ink, and began to write with the painstaking precision of a man more accustomed to action than words. "My dearest Lily, when you read this, you will be grown, and I will be only a shadow in your memory, if that. But know this, you were loved. Deeply and completely loved by the people who brought you into this world, and by those of us blessed to care for you after they were gone. Your father, Matthew McKenzie, was my brother. He was the better of us in every way that matters. He had our father's gift for working with horses, our mother's talent for music, and a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. He loved the land with a passion I never understood, until I watched you discover the world around you with that same wonder in your eyes. Your mother, Sarah, I never had the privilege to meet, but I know she must have been extraordinary for Matthew to have loved her as he did. The letters he wrote spoke of her courage in leaving behind everything familiar to build a life with him in the West. He described her gentle spirit, her determination, and how she sang to you before you were even born. I paused, the memory of Matthew's last letter bringing a thickness to my throat. Clara had moved to stand by the fire, giving me privacy for this task, though she remained close enough that I could hear the soft rustle of her skirts as she stirred the embers. You came to me unexpected, like the first spring flower breaking through snow. I didn't know how to care for you, didn't believe I had it in me to be what you needed, but you taught me what love truly is. Not the absence of fear, but the courage to push through it. Not perfection, but the willingness to try again when you fail. I hope your life with your mother's family brings you every advantage they've promised. I hope you grow strong and wise and happy. I hope you dance at fancy balls and learn to play the piano and have everything your heart desires. But I also hope that sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way, or when you see a star-filled sky above open land, you'll feel something stir inside you that cannot be named. Your Mackenzie blood, calling to the wilderness, to freedom, to the untamed beauty of the world your father loved. Know that wherever you go, whatever you become, there is a place in Wyoming territory where you were cherished beyond measure. There are people who will remember you always, who will look for glimpses of you in every child's laugh, in every sunset, in every moment of unexpected joy. With all my heart, your Uncle Jedediah. I set the pen down, my vision blurred with tears I refused to shed. The letter seemed inadequate, a poor substitute for the lifetime of moments I'd begun to imagine sharing with Lily, teaching her to ride, watching her start school, seeing her grow into a young woman who might have carried something of Matthew's spirit into the future. Clara returned to her packing, now gathering the small toys and keepsakes that had accumulated during Lily's time with us. The wooden horse I'd carved, a rag doll from Mrs. Abernathy, a tiny silver rattle Pastor Wells had presented at her christening. Each item disappeared into the trunk, another piece of our hearts to accompany Lily on her journey. I always knew this was temporary, I said, my voice rough with unshed tears as I folded the letter carefully and sealed it with a drop of wax. From the moment I found her on my doorstep. Clara's hands froze in the act of wrapping the silver rattle. When she looked up, her eyes held a fire I hadn't seen since the days of our courtship, when she'd challenged me to see beyond the narrow confines of my own certainties. "Is that what you tell yourself about everything that matters?" she asked, her own grief making her bold. "That nothing lasts, so why try it all?" Her words struck with the precision of a well-aimed arrow, finding the vulnerable place in the armor I'd constructed around my heart years ago. I pushed back from the table, wounded pride demanding distance, but found myself moving toward her instead. "What would you have me say, Clara? That I fooled myself into believing she could be mine? That I dared to dream of a future that was never possible?" My voice rose despite my efforts to control it. Yes, I let myself care. Yes, I let myself love her. And now I'm losing her, just as I've lost everyone else I ever... I broke off, the admission too dangerous to complete. Clara stood her ground, unintimidated by my outburst. "Everyone you ever loved," she finished for me, her voice softly insistent. "Your parents, Matthew, me." "Yes," I admitted, the fight draining out of me as quickly as it had risen. "Everyone. But you haven't lost me, Jedediah," she said, closing the distance between us. "I'm right here. I've been right here all along, waiting for you to decide that some things, some people, are worth the risk of pain." The rawness of her confession hung in the air between us, stripping away the careful politeness we'd maintained these past months. In her grief-brightened eyes, I saw the same desolation I felt at Lily's impending departure, but also something else. A stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. Even if I believed that, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, what does it matter now? By this time tomorrow, Lily will be gone. Whatever we've built here, this makeshift family, it ends with her. Clara reached for my hand, her fingers twining with mine in a gesture so natural it made my heart ache. Only if we let it, she said. Only if you walk away again. I couldn't answer, the possibility she offered too fragile, too precious to examine directly. Instead, I tightened my grip on her hand and drew her closer, until her head rested against my shoulder. We stood that way for a long moment, drawing strength from each other in a manner that would have been unthinkable mere months ago. Come, Clara finally said, tugging me gently toward Lily's cradle. Let's not waste these hours in grief before they're gone. We settled on the rug beside the cradle, our backs against the wall, shoulders touching. Clara reached in to stroke Lily's downy hair, humming softly, the same lullaby I'd heard her sing 100 times over the past months. I found myself joining in, my rough baritone a counterpoint to her sweet soprano. As the night deepened around us, the last log on the fire collapsed into embers, casting the room in a ruddy glow. Clara's head gradually came to rest against my shoulder, her breathing slowing, though I knew she didn't sleep. Nor did I, determined to witness every remaining moment of Lily's presence in our lives. We talked in whispers, sharing memories of Lily's first smile, her attempts to roll over, the way she'd grabbed for Clara's hair when being held, trivial moments, ordinary miracles that had transformed two broken people into something resembling a family. Do you think she'll remember any of this? I asked as the mantel clock ticked relentlessly toward dawn. Any of us? Clara considered the question with the thoughtfulness I'd always admired in her. Not in the way we remember, she finally said. But I believe love leaves its mark on the soul, even when the mind can't recall its source. I hope you're right, I whispered, watching as Lily stirred slightly in her sleep, one tiny hand extending beyond the blanket. Without thinking, I reached out, letting her fingers curl around mine in that instinctive grasp that had first captured my heart the day she arrived. Outside, the eastern sky began to lighten imperceptibly, night giving way to dawn with the inevitable rhythm that governed all things. Clara's hand found mine again, her grip tightening as we both recognized the approaching hour of parting. I don't know if I can do this, I admitted, the confession torn from some deep place I rarely acknowledged. I don't know if I'm strong enough to hand her over and walk away. Clara turned to face me, our faces close in the dying firelight. You are, she said with quiet certainty, because you love her enough to want what's best for her, even at the cost of your own heart. She paused, her next words barely audible. That's always been your strength, Jedediah. And your curse. In her eyes, I saw not just grief for Lily, but the echo of an older pain. The wound I'd inflicted when I'd walked away 5 years ago, convinced I was sparing her a life with a broken man. The parallel struck me with the force of revelation. Once again, I was preparing to surrender someone I loved, believing it was for their own good. What if I'm wrong? I asked, the question encompassing far more than just Lily's situation. What if what looks like sacrifice is really just fear? Clara's answer was lost as Lily stirred and whimpered, her eyes blinking open to greet the new day, her last day with us. As Clara lifted her from the cradle, murmuring soft endearments, I rose to stoke the fire and face the moment the Harringtons had appeared at the schoolhouse door. The night's vigil had brought no solutions, offered no escape from the reality awaiting us at 9 o'clock. But somehow, in the sharing of our grief, in the quiet honesty forced upon us by impending loss, something had shifted between Clara and me. Something that felt, despite everything, like the first fragile tendril of hope taking root in rocky soil. The Timber Creek Hotel stood 3 stories tall at the end of Main Street, its false-fronted grandeur an attempt to bring Eastern civilization to the Wyoming frontier. This morning, the building seemed to loom larger than usual, its windows reflecting the pale winter sunlight with an unforgiving glare as Clara and I approached, Lily bundled snugly in my arms. A private coach waited outside, not the regular stagecoach that served the territory, but a hired conveyance with matched bay horses stomping impatiently in their traces, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The driver, a weathered man in a bearskin coat, supervised as a porter loaded an assortment of expensive luggage onto the roof. The sight of those leather trunks with their brass fittings and foreign hotel labels made the knot in my stomach tighten painfully. "Are you ready?" Clara asked softly, her gloved hand resting briefly on my arm. I wasn't ready, would never be ready. But I nodded stiffly, shifting Lily in my arms so I could look at her face one last time before entering the hotel. She was awake and alert, her blue eyes taking in the bustling activity around her with the innocent curiosity that never failed to remind me of Matthew. "There's my sweet girl," I whispered, pressing my lips to her forehead and breathing in her scent, milk and soap and something uniquely Lily that I knew would haunt my dreams for years to come. The hotel lobby smelled of beeswax and coffee, the polished wood counter and potted palms giving it an air of sophistication at odds with the dusty, practical nature of Timber Creek itself. The Harringtons waited beside the crackling hearth, their traveling clothes impeccable despite the early hour. Victoria Harrington's face brightened visibly at the sight of Lily, though she maintained her composed demeanor as we approached. "Good morning, Mr. Mackenzie, Miss Holloway." Edward Harrington greeted us with formal politeness. "I trust the child slept well." "She did," Clara answered when I couldn't find my voice. "She's always been a good sleeper." Victoria moved forward, her eyes fixed on Lily with an expression of genuine tenderness that took me aback. "Sarah's eyes," she murmured, reaching out one gloved finger to touch Lily's cheek. "But I see her father in her, too." The acknowledgement of Matthew in Lily's features, coming from this woman who had never met my brother, loosened something tight in my chest. Perhaps they would not erase him from Lily's life after all. "We've brought her things," Clara said, indicating the smaller trunk we'd left with the porter. "All her clothes, some toys, and a few keepsakes." Edward Harrington nodded. "Most thoughtful of you. We'll ensure she keeps them." An awkward silence fell, broken only by Lily's soft babbling as she reached for a strand of Clara's hair that had escaped her bonnet. We had arrived at the moment I'd been dreading since dawn. The moment when I would have to surrender this child who had become the center of my world to virtual strangers. "We should be on our way," Victoria said gently. "The driver wishes to make significant progress before nightfall." I looked down at Lily, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the tiny dimple in her chin, the way her sandy eyebrows arched in a perfect echo of Matthew's. Words failed me completely as I pressed one last kiss to her forehead before extending my arms toward Victoria Harrington. The physical act of passing Lily from my arms to her aunt's felt like tearing out a piece of my own heart. Lily, sensing something amiss, turned back toward me with a confused expression that quickly crumpled into distress. Her small face reddened as she began to cry, reaching her arms back toward me with a desperation that nearly broke my resolve. "There now, little one," Victoria soothed, bouncing Lily gently in a practiced motion. "You'll be just fine." But Lily continued to cry, her eyes fixed on me with an expression of betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. I took an involuntary step forward, every instinct demanding I reclaim her, consequences be damned. Clara's hand on my arm stopped me, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "She needs to settle with them," she whispered, though her voice caught on the words. "Making it harder will only distress her more." I knew she was right, but standing still while Lily cried for me required more strength than facing down armed outlaws ever had. Edward Harrington, perhaps sensing my struggle, moved toward the door with purposeful steps. "We have a comfortable traveling bassinet in the coach," he assured us, "and toys to distract her. Children are remarkably adaptable at this age." This clinical assessment of Lily's ability to forget us did nothing to ease the ache spreading through my chest. Clara stepped forward, presenting Victoria with a small package, wrapped in muslin. "I made this for Lily," she explained, her voice steadier than I would have thought possible given the brightness in her eyes. "It's a cloth book with Bible verses. My students helped embroider the pictures." Victoria accepted it with genuine appreciation. "How thoughtful. We'll be sure to read it to her often. Clara reached into her reticule and withdrew a small envelope. "And this is for you, Mr. McKenzie," she said, turning to me. "A lock of Lily's hair. I saved it when I trimmed her bangs last week. I thought you might want something to remember her by." The simple act of kindness, so like Clara to think of preserving this piece of Lily for me, was my undoing. I stared at the envelope, unable to accept this token that would only serve as a constant reminder of all I was losing. My hands remained at my sides, fists clenched against the urge to reach for Lily one last time. Clara's eyes clouded with hurt as I failed to take her offering, but she quickly composed herself, tucking the envelope back into her reticule without comment. "We truly appreciate all you've done for our niece," Edward Harrington said, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the emotional undercurrent swirling around us. "You'll both be in our prayers." With that inadequate farewell, they moved toward the door, Lily still crying, though her sobs had diminished to hiccuping whimpers. I followed them outside, my legs moving of their own accord, every step an exercise in restraint. The driver helped Victoria into the coach, handling her with care as she balanced Lily against her shoulder. Through the coach window, I caught one last glimpse of my niece's face, her eyes red-rimmed and confused, before Edward Harrington climbed in and pulled the curtain closed. The crack of the driver's whip echoed down the empty street as the coach lurched forward. I stood motionless, watching as it grew smaller in the distance, carrying away the child who had changed everything in my life since appearing on my doorstep that snowy December morning. "Jedediah," Clara said softly, coming to stand beside me. Her hand reached for mine, seeking connection in our shared grief. But the emptiness inside me had expanded to fill every corner of my being, leaving no room for comfort or consolation. Without a word, I turned toward the hitching post where I'd left my horse. My hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of checking the cinch and adjusting the stirrup. "Where are you going?" Clara asked, alarm evident in her voice as she realized my intentions. "Back to my cabin," I answered, the words rough and foreign in my throat. "My ranger duties have been neglected too long." "Jedediah, please," she said, her composure finally cracking. "Don't do this. Not now. Not when we both need." I swung into the saddle, cutting off her plea. At the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, I felt a distant pang of regret, but it was buried beneath the overwhelming need to escape, to return to the solitude that had been my refuge for so long. "I can't do this, Clara," I said, unable to meet her eyes. "I can't pretend there's anything left here for me now." "There's me?" she whispered, the words barely audible over the stamp of my horse's hooves. "There's us." But I had already turned away, spurring my mount into a trot down the muddy street. Behind me, I heard Clara call my name once more, her voice breaking on the syllables. I didn't look back. Couldn't bear to see the pain I was inflicting by leaving her again with no promise of return. The buildings of Timber Creek fell away as I urged my horse faster, heading for the foothills and the isolated cabin that awaited me. The wind stung my face, cutting through my coat and bringing tears to my eyes. Tears I told myself were merely from the cold, though they flowed with a heat that belied that explanation. Lily was gone. The borrowed time I'd been granted with her had run out, exactly as I'd always known it would. And like a coward, I was running from the one person who might have helped me bear that loss, the one woman who understood exactly what I was feeling because she felt it too. As I rode, a verse from Clara's worn Bible came to me unbidden, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. I'd never fully understood those words until this moment, when my grief cast a shadow over everything, turning the bright promise of what Clara and I might have built together into a distant, unreachable dream. Behind me lay heartache and loss, but also the possibility of healing. Ahead lay the familiar emptiness of my solitary existence, and I was galloping toward it with all the desperate speed of a man fleeing not just his pain, but the chance of ever feeling anything again, even love.